Okay, and we are live. Hey, everybody. Thanks for wanting to tune in. And for those of you that are coming in gradually, I just wanted to say Happy New Year. And we're closer to the 2 year anniversary almost of this YouTube channel. So I just wanted to say thank you to those that have really contributed with their comments, with letting other people know of what the podcast stands for, and everything else in terms of just interaction. Right, I really like people learning about the videos that I make and the content that I produce, and amazing guests that I am able to have on. So just want to say thank you to those that again have contributed. Pretty much for this live interview, we have Obsidian here. For those of you, last time we had Obsidian on earlier, so welcome, Obsidian. Thank you for your time, for wanting to come on. And this is kind of just going to be a continuation almost from our last live. So yeah, Obsidian, again, thanks. And maybe you could reintroduce, if you don't mind, just like to the guests and those people that are new coming in.
Hello,
Who
I'm
you are.
Obsidian. I am from Arizona. I'm a dual resident of Arizona and California. I was raised in California under the Chicano movement. My parents and my grandparents are all from Mexico. And I have been looking for my tribal lineage. And so I found them years ago. And it turns out that my grandparents are from Mexico and different lineages. And I'll go into that a little later. Um, but I am also an ethno-linguist. And so what I do is I look into Native American languages and how they originated in the Americas and how we're all connected through language. And then I'm also a Mesoamericanist. So basically, what that means is that I study the cultures in Mesoamerica, and that includes Mexico and part of South America. And these are cultures that date back before colonial times or before the invasion of Europeans. And then I'm also a Mayanist, which means that I like to talk about or study Maya culture. And so that's one of my I think my forms of education started there, and so I just concentrate on that, on the Maya culture, and then I also teach classical Nahuatl.
Oh, thanks for sharing all of that. Wow. Maybe we could start off first with the it's cup. I'm gonna. I don't want to butcher this. The it's papalotzen.
It's Papalotzin.
Yeah.
So that name was given to me by my late husband, my children's father. So I have three children; they're grown already, and their father, Aluktek, his grandfather Krober, he gave me that name, It's Papalotzin. So it started off with um, he was naming people. He used to do naming ceremonies, and at one of the naming ceremonies, I used to help him with giving names because, of course, I spoke the Nahuatl language. And at one of them, after many years of doing this with him, he finally told me, "Hey, you know what? We need to give you a name." And Eats papalot means eats means obsidian, and then papalot is a butterfly. And when you end it with tin, it gives it like a form of respect. So it's like a lady eats papalotzin. So a lady obsidian butterfly. That's what he was trying to put together for me, and he did that in a peyote ceremony. So that's how I got my name.
Oh, that's fascinating. Yeah, it's always interesting to meet like people from Mexico who do like have indigenous names, right?
Yeah,
Um,
and it goes deeper. Like each name, so different people get names for different reasons. Like in Mexico, initially, when you got a name, it was given to you by the midwife, unless you were nobility. If you were nobility, you were giving a name by the midwife when you were born, but then you would get a title as you got older. And the title was based on the achievements that you had created throughout your life. And so if you were a great warrior, or if you were in, and they could see like what was the um I don't want to use the word spirit, but that's kind of like what it was. It was like, what kind of animal comes out of you, or like what do they see according to the stars. that that you would represent, and that's what they would name you. And so you'll see that a lot of people nowadays who are trying to find their indigenous side will go to the Tonalama or Tonalmachut, and they'll look up their birthday, year, and time, and then base it off of that.
Oh, okay, that's really cool because I think with many other places in South America and outside of like Mexico, right? Maybe it's harder to meet people with those types of like indigenous names, right? Like for Peru, almost for example, like most Peruvians that I know have like Spanish names, right?
Right.
And other places as well. So it could just be the fact that the U.S. is much closer to Mexico, so me meeting people from Mexico is more easier than meeting someone from Peru or Bolivia or someone else from other countries. So I just think that's really unique. That
Right. And then also with those names, that's exactly what I was going with my children. I didn't name them English names, or even a Spanish name. I gave them all Nahuatl names. And then of course they had the surname that goes with their dad. So they got their dad's last name, but I it was hard for them when they were in kinder trying to like learn how to write these names because they're like about 13 to 14 letters long. And so they had a hard time, and they would tease them and make fun of them and kind of chastise them at school. And then I just told them it's just going to make you stronger, and then you're going to know who you are, and and where you come from.
Yeah, that's unfortunate that they did get teased, but I feel like a lot of kids that do go through that, they do become stronger over time. And for example, like for your kids that had those names, those really beautiful native names, they just learn to, I don't want to say like accept, but taking in that sort of like negative interactions they've had, but it's made them stronger, right? In a way, right? That
I mean,
shows.
they had times where they were upset and they were
Yeah,
like, well, why didn't you teach me Spanish? And then why didn't you give me a regular name? They go through, I think, all children who are being teased and bullied
sure.
for being indigenous or representing their culture. And this could go for any culture. It could go for names that are not from here,
Right.
not English names or not, So, but yeah, I even at one point remember speaking to other nations, like the Dene nations. They are starting to use traditional names again, and so you'll see a lot of them tell me the same thing, like, hey, I can't really use my name. I use my middle name that is in English because they don't want to pronounce my name correctly, or they make fun of it. And there's another thing about names too that so if there are names that you're given during naming ceremonies that are so sacred that you're not supposed to give them out to other people. So, and this goes back to a lot of cultures where they say don't use the name that goes with your birth name, that people could do things to you, like kind of uh, witchcraft. But I don't believe in that, but I do believe that what they're saying is your name is so sacred that they could use it in a negative way. And so in those days, like, you couldn't really give out your indigenous name that was given to you in a ceremony. And so because they could use that against you, well, if they could pronounce it. But
Yeah.
yeah, and so um it just depends on the people. But that's another reason why some people don't give you their whole name. They'll give you nicknames. There's a lot of times they'll just give you like shortened versions or nicknames, or their middle name and not their whole entire name.
Yeah. 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 Thanks for sharing that. Um, I really wanted to get into like the work that you do also, right? And right, looking at the script here, you study the way perception and conceptualization influences indigenous language and how that is linked to like different cultures and societies. So, what really started your interest at that? Like, at what point in your life, if you don't mind me asking?
Well, as growing up, I could learn different languages, and so I thought it was interesting. I picked up like Latin languages really quickly, and I took a medical terminology course, like like all advanced courses, like the beginning, intermediate, and advanced. And I got to the point where I was like, hey, this is all based on Latin, and it's not that hard to understand because if you speak Spanish, which I already knew Spanish, I figured this shouldn't be too hard. And so I ended up figuring out later on that I could actually learn different languages. And then I joined the military, and I was a linguist in the military. And it's a crypto linguist, so you could learn like different. So I actually scored pretty high in the language battery of tests, and so I was like, well, what other languages could I learn? So I learned Arabic, and then at the very end, well, I didn't finish that whole course because I had some medical issues during that time, so they bumped me over to a different language. I ended up in Russian, and that's the last language I learned in the military. But during that whole time, I always was interested in learning Nahuatl, because almost everything in Mexico is named in Nahuatl. Like there's Spanish everywhere, right? Like they'll tell you, they'll teach. Like I was taught Spanish growing up, so I understood it. But then there was other words that I didn't understand. The streets are named after different leaders, different Aztec leaders or Mexica leaders, and you go to the stores, and then there was even like a flea market, and it was called tianguis, and tianguis is the original word for market, marqueta. So I was like, where did that word come from? So eventually, it it kind of like I decided, okay, so I guess I am okay at learning languages, that I should actually focus on that. But because my mind is very analytical, and it has to do with my science that I have in Aztec culture. I do have Kali. I'm 13 Kali twice. And so my mind analyzes things. I'm very analytical. So I would always wonder, like, okay, so tianguis came from this, and then this word comes from Nahuatl, and then there's different variants of Nahuatl. So I was like, I got to learn classical. And so I started studying how the indigenous culture of the Mexicas influenced almost everything that has to do with Mexico. And so that's how I became an ethnolinguist. Little did I know that
Amazing.
as I kept studying and becoming a linguist, I was able to figure out that language was what connected all of us together, and that we didn't all speak the same languages, and that Nahuatl was not the only language in Mexico. And there was actually like another 160 indigenous languages that were alive at the time when I was younger. Um, I'm 48 years old. And so now it's sad, but we have lost a lot of tribes. They have been obliterated, literally. I remember when I was in my 20s, the Mexican government was going in there and destroying and just massacring tribes at that time. And we lost a lot of beautiful languages because of that. And we lost the people, you know, and the culture. It's all gone. And so now we're down to like about 67 or so. I could be wrong, so don't quote me on that, but we're around in the 60-ish amount of tribes left in Mexico. And a lot of them there's maybe about a third of them have Nahuatl. They're Nahuatl based. And then there's Maya and Quiche. And then they have their own languages that kind of stem off of, like, they're not even related to each other at all. Like the Mayo and the Yaqui or the Yoeme, they have a language that's similar, that's under Uto-Aztecan. So there's family groups. So that's how I got into linguistics, is because I did see there was a lot of non-native people who were learning all these languages and kind of breaking them down and then teaching other people what they were. And I was like, I think we need a native narrative. Like, we have to come in here and speak for our own people. And so that's how I got into that. With linguistics, you end up finding out that our ancestors see things so different through the language. And so some of the people who don't understand the classical Nahuatl or any of the native languages in the Americas, they have a lack of understanding indigenous philosophy. So that everything is in the language. There's like stuff that's like unwritten. There's stuff that cannot translate into English or Spanish. There's sayings, aphorisms, ideology that you're never going to pick up unless you start learning these native languages. That's why linguistics to me was like, that's where I need to go, because I feel like that's the glue. That's what's going to stick us together. And that's also what's going to keep our people alive and our tribes. And that's the reason why I got into it.
That's really fascinating. So if you don't mind me asking, how many languages can you speak?
Okay, hold on. I'm gonna count them. So I speak Spanish, English, Russian, Nahuatl, and then a little Arabic. And my Arabic, I lost it because I didn't finish my whole course. So, and I don't practice it, but if I listen to it, I can understand that one. And then I just recently started learning Japanese, and
Wow.
that's like what, six? About six. Yeah, but and I can understand basic Latin. So if I see anything in Latin, it's not that hard to understand. But I can't say that I actually took a course in it and I'm fluent. I'm not.
Wow. That's really impressive because I remember in the last video that we had, you had said you really wanted to learn like Chinese, right? And I was about to like ask you like 你会说中文吗? And it's like you can speak Chinese, right? So
I really want to
that's
learn.
yeah, it's really how should I say this? If you really want to learn the language, like I think it's not so hard, right? Like I took Chinese class and but I had like the the goal of wanting to like, learn as much as I could. But I feel like if it's someone that's just like not so much interested, but just is kind of wants to take it anyway out of curiosity, it's kind of hard. And obviously, like seeing from you, like you really want to learn it and knowing that you like know 5 languages almost pretty much, right? That's so impressive. So it's just interesting how people can learn languages like quickly, and for others, like it takes a little bit of time, right? But Chinese isn't even easy. It's
No,
quite
it's actually one of the more complicated languages in the military. So they kept not wanting to give it to me. Everybody wanted that language because they get paid more, I guess, and they get to go to like special missions and stuff and such. And so I was like, I want that language, but I didn't get it. I ended up getting Arabic, and then, but I think it had to do with the time that I was in the military. And in the time that I joined the military was during 9/11, so it had to do with like uh, the problems that the United States was having with the Middle East, and uh, so and Afghanistan, and they were just going in and out of all those countries. So, and then they were on the borders of Czechoslovakia and such, near Russia. So that's how I ended up with those language, and it is like that in the military. It's depending on what they need. That's where they put you, and so I didn't end up getting to choose. But there was one thing that you said that's important about language is that it is for, if you have the desire is very important because it does enable you. It opens up those synapses. But if you don't learn more than one language by the time you're 9 years old, those synapses, they end up dying off. And so because you didn't use them, they just figure, okay, I don't need them. And so it gets a little harder for people to learn more languages as they get older. I mean, now that people know that, you'll notice like you'll notice a lot of people who are in these like special private schools, they know lots of languages, because their parents knew, okay, we better get these kids into like these different languages, learning them fast. But if you go to third world countries, this is the craziest thing. The poorest of people know more than one language, which is crazy. And I remember going to Cancun with my family, and the man who was chauffeuring us around, he literally knew his native language. He knew English, Spanish, he knew French, because he was telling us all the tourism that comes in and that they have to learn all these languages if they want to make money, because they have to communicate, and then they go around taking people on tours, so they have to learn their languages, and that's why that's their incentive, to learn more than one language.
Have you seen the video of the it was like a couple years ago. It was like I think it was a French couple that like just recorded this Cambodian boy. I think he was working as like kind of like a tour guide or something, and he was able to speak like 9 or 10 different languages like really quickly. It was insane.
Oh,
So it just sorry.
I said, wow.
Yeah. It was really impressive. But it is also like kind of I guess this is somewhat like concerning a little bit. Not so much that like the fact that people from outside the US can speak like so many different languages. I'm talking about like why Americans, like why there's not as much of a push for the younger generations to like learn different languages, right? Like I've been to the Philippines, China, you know, not. I think people in Asia, just from my experience, are able to speak English more so and use it more than maybe people in Peru, from my perspective, right? Like a lot of Peruvians and those from Guatemala that I've met, sometimes I think have a little bit more difficulty to speak English. Of course, obviously, we can go back into the history of the Philippines, right, and how it was like an English colony, of course, right.
Mhm.
But I guess I look at it more so from like a geographical sense of that, like those Asian countries are all the way, on the other side of the planet. Um, unlike like the countries in Latin America, right?
What
Um,
I've seen with because I'm very into like the Asian cultures. I like I watch a lot of K drama, so Korean drama is like a big thing for me. And I noticed that the reason why they do learn all these other languages is because they're into finance a lot. They really they they do a lot of international business, and so hospitality is the big thing. Excuse me.
okay.
And so I noticed that that's one of the things that they do is since they're very young, they end up learning all these different languages. That's one of the things, and I like it because I can understand a lot. They say they also use a lot of cognates, so they'll use stuff like to compute. They always say stuff like "thank you" and "kopi" because they don't have a word for coffee in their languages. There's a lot of foods and different things that they don't eat and that's not original to them. So they'll say kopi instead of coffee. Yeah. So I noticed that they do that too sometimes. Hold on. I'm going to do something really quick.
Sure.
Um, but you can keep asking me questions as I go.
Oh, yeah. Well, I was just curious. How many years did you spend in the military?
2 years.
Oh, just 2 years.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
didn't. So what happened was I ended up getting pregnant, so I had to get out early. I always say Tez saved my little Tezcatlipoca, my baby, my youngest. He got me out of the military. I got pregnant and I was having complications, so I ended up getting out of the military um, because of him. So that's what ended up happening.
How were the 2 years, if you don't mind me asking?
You know what? It was really easy for me because I ended up. My dad was like a drill sergeant growing up,
Okay.
so I didn't. To me, it was nothing. I was like, "Oh, this is easy," you know. I was
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
I didn't feel like it was a hard thing to do. There was a lot of girls that were crying. I had been pushed so hard by my family growing up. My dad was like the kind of person that he worked out in the fields. They were both farm workers, and so they expected us girls to learn how to cook and clean. And so we were cooking and cleaning, and then the boys were like doing chores, taking out the trash, doing all this stuff. Now, don't get me wrong though. When my mom would be home with us, like sometimes during the summer, she would take some time off. And when she was teaching us, she told the boys, "No, you guys are gonna learn the same thing as the girls, and you guys are gonna learn how to wash dishes and like do all this stuff because if your wives get pregnant, you guys are not gonna be sitting at home not knowing what to do, and you guys have to learn how to cook because you're gonna have to cook for yourself and help your wife when she's having the babies and stuff like that." But yeah, so I ended up learning like a lot of stuff from my dad and my mom on how to deal with like pressure. And I had to help my parents take care of the little ones because I'm the second oldest. So by the time I got in the military, it was like nothing. And so even if they were yelling at me, and I would just sometimes I would laugh and I get in trouble because they were just like, they would yell at me,
Yeah.
be like, "What's so funny?" And then I had push-ups, and so I was like, "Oh, sorry."
Yeah.
you
I
know.
was gonna say then the Shark Tank must have not been very hard then.
So yeah, so when I went in, this is hilarious. So I went in there and everybody was like scared, because they were just like, they came out crying, like literally crying, and then I'd be like, "What? Why are they crying?" And so we went in there and they make you count to 10 and they're like, "Say your social security number." So I'm all screaming my social security number. And then when I came out, like my eyes were red and everything, but I wasn't crying or anything, and they're just like, "What, you think you're better than everybody else?" And I'm like, "No, but like, have you ever gotten chile in your mouth and in your eyes? Because I had chile many times. So it wasn't like that bad. Yeah, it burned, but it just felt like you got habanero in your eye or something. Or, after you help your mom peel a whole bunch of chiles and then you accidentally rub your eye. Like, so that's pretty much what happened to me. So it wasn't that hard. So.
You're prepared.
Yeah. And you know what, too? It has to do with how you make things in your life. If you're going to, my dad said, everything's in your head. It's all in your head. So if you end up like making it a big deal that, like you're bothered by certain things really easily, then that's going to happen to you. You're not going to make it. You're not going to make it in these like hardcore situations in your life. So I was just like, and it kind of felt like a little break because by then I was married and I had 2 kids. And so I was like, awesome. I just get to chill. And then I get to go to the chow hall and they're cooking for me. And all I had to do is work out. So I lost a bunch of weight and I was like happy when I got home. But yeah, boot camp at least was easier. It was a little frustrating that you have a hard time because you don't get to spend a lot of time with your family, and it's the motto of hurry up and wait. That was very annoying and it's real. So they make you like get into formation, get up at 4 a.m, be there by 5, and then you're just waiting, and your commanding officers are not there. They're doing their own thing, and you're just like, I'm waiting out here while my kids are at home. Like I used to feel bad. Like this not the life, not a good life for me. But it didn't matter. Like it wasn't like I was upset. If I had a good place for my kids to be, I was happy. I just ended up getting out because I was pregnant and I couldn't carry the baby while I was in the military. I needed to get out. It ended up hurting my pregnancy, and so I got out.
Yeah, I'm glad you're able to.
Yeah.
But yeah, I've definitely heard things about like boot camp and whatnot, right? It's interesting you brought up, like, from what I hear, like through a lot of like the weekend like drills and whatnot, right? It's a lot of like, lifting weights, and just like kind of like training, whatnot. So it's just interesting to learn about like people in the military.
I like that part. That was my favorite part, working out. And because I was in military intelligence, I ended up with like a lot of like and I don't want to stereotype it, a lot of more nerdier people. So they were like the big buffed, like Marines and stuff like that, and all the more hardcore girls that were in the military, or females, or like, I don't want to assume their gender, but they were tougher in the Marine Corps than they were in the Army where I was at, or the Air Force. So I was happy because I would like do push-ups, and it was funny. Yeah.
Yeah, my friend was in the Marines and he said he actually like enjoyed boot camp, and I heard that was like the most difficult of all like boot camps between like Navy, Air Force, and the Army.
Mm-hmm. They also have to go underwater, so it's a little bit different.
Yeah, it's crazy. But anyway, sorry.
Okay, let me get back to you. Yeah.
Yeah. You said, sorry.
I'm following the script from here.
Oh, you're okay.
What I was going to say next.
I think you bring up about like being a Mesoamericanist, right? And you specialize in like descriptive linguistics of the indigenous language of like Mesoamerica. I just think that is really fascinating to meet people that are interested in linguistics and whatnot. Mostly because like, if you look back in the history of Mexico, so many indigenous languages like were suppressed, right? Or even just banned outright. And now, here we are in like the 21st century, and there's people trying to like do a lot of like revitalization of indigenous cultures and languages. And despite my objections, like with the governments of Mexico and many other Latin American governments in their history of cruelty against indigenous people and indigenous erasure, you are starting to see like this revitalization, as I said, right? And now even in the US, you see people that are like trying to connect to like their indigenous like native roots, right? And I think we'll get more into that into the second part here. So yeah, I just think it's really fascinating, and that you say that you're a minus too. And I think I wanted to move on to just like a little bit of the classical Nahuatl instructor, so like the classes that you teach.
Okay, so when COVID started, I kind of stopped teaching it for a while, so I haven't really been teaching since COVID hit. I lost family members. I had to really take really good care of my parents because they're older age. So, you know, we had to do all the immunizations and make sure they were, you know, my mom was going through some surgeries and stuff. So I kind of stayed home so I wouldn't have to get them sick. And then I realized, well, I could actually teach this online. And it's actually amazing that because of COVID, so many people learn to teach and take their curriculums online. And so I figured out a way where I can teach online now. And I'm working on my whole, on my plans, my teaching plans. And so, but one of the things that I was teaching was, I went to classical Nahuatl because when I first started to like learn, um, the books that we had were basically all classical. So I have some really ancient books that are like falling apart, and then I have workbooks that no one has anymore. They're not in print. So I learned the Nahuatl. Plus, I also had family members that knew Nahuatl, and so my great grandmother on my mother's side, she her grandmother, she spoke Corachol, which is a form of Nahuatl. And so because of that, there was some words that were already coming natural to me, and a lot of the, I think that I grew up with those teachings already, that when I started reading them, I was like, oh yeah, that's true, that's what, you know, we do that and we do this and we do that. So it all came natural once I started learning it. And later on I found out that there's so many different variants, and it depends on where you live in Mexico and what Nahua culture it is. So this is how it kind of works. It breaks down like this. So when so you have different family groups. We have like three main branches, or we have more than that, but there's like these branches of Native American languages. And Uto-Aztecan is one of those family groups. And I'll get into a little bit more later on another interview to break down like actual linguistics. I can actually break down like what all the native languages are spoken in the Americas. But one of them that I focus in my study is more involved with Uto-Aztecan languages. So under that, it's kind of like a Latin, right? And so that Latin would be the root language. So Uto-Aztecan is this root language. And then off of that, it's an umbrella. And underneath that, there's all these different languages. Nahuatl happens to be one of them, but there's more than one type of Nahuatl. And so classical means that it was the language that was being spoken in Mexico Tenochtitlan and in that area by the Mexicas at the time of the invasion by the Spaniards. And they call it classical because it was documented. So anytime you hear something like that is like classical Greek, for instance, that means it was being documented. And so the classical Nahuatl that was being documented, the people at that time were mostly Europeans that were coming in, the Spaniards and the French, and they were writing down and making books, and there was even Germans, I believe, and they were all writing and making books that had to do with Nahuatl. And so that's the language that I have been drawn to. But there's others. So the main spoken Nahuatl language now is Huasteca, which is the farthest of being understood now. Like it doesn't really sound like Nahuatl sometimes, you know? It just depends on where you're learning the Huasteca from. There's so many different speakers of it too. And so as you go, there's even some that are mixed with Mayan. So you have Maya Nahuatl languages too that are mixed in together. And then there's even like other like Mixe Zoque with a little bit of Nahuatl in them. So because all these languages were being mixed, because we were kind of running away from these like Spaniards and the Europeans, and we were trying to hide, and then other tribes would take us in, and then we would immerse and teach each other different languages. So now you have like these new languages that emerged from Nahuatl. So it gets a little complicated, right? So that's why I stick with the classical Nahuatl, so that if I at least know this main language, I can understand a lot of the other ones at that point. But I do feel like there's this movement going now, which I actually support. I support new movements when it comes to indigenous groups. And there's a new movement now that it's called, it's a neo or modern Nahuatl is what they call it. And there's even a school in Los Angeles where you can go and learn it. And I happen to know the people that are teaching, and they're wonderful people. I really support them. I'll link you to them if anyone's ever interested in it. I'll link you to them. But there's all these different modern Nahuatl groups that are coming forward and saying, hey, let's like everyone learn Nahuatl somehow from these people in Los Angeles, and it's working out for them. They've got a large following of Nahuatl speakers at this point, and it is Huasteca Nahuatl. That's what it is, most of it. But they call it modern Nahuatl, but most of it is Huasteca. Because I tried to learn the variant, and I was asking them a lot of questions like, you call it modern, but it sounds like Huasteca, and I kept trying to get it from them, like, you guys, where did you learn this Nahuatl? And I finally got to the nitty gritty of once I took the course, or I would like listen to them, and I'd be like, you guys are speaking Huasteca mostly, and then you're kind of grabbing some more Nahuatl words from all these other different variants and stuff. But it was good because now the Nahuatl speakers from different variants can understand each other through that modern one. So it's still a good thing. It's like some people don't like it because it's new and different. And when something's different and you don't understand what they're doing with it, you kind of want to like rebel against it. And I don't encourage that. I encourage people to let them teach those classes. If you're not sure what they're learning and now go in there and take them yourself so you can understand. That's what I did. Because I was like, okay, I want to find out what you guys are teaching each other, you know, so I could talk to you guys too, so I can know like where you guys coming from. But I went in there with classical Nahuatl knowledge, so I understood it.
Wow, super impressive. No,
Mm-hmm. It gets complicated though. Yeah.
Sorry.
It gets complicated. Yeah.
Yeah.
You think it's one thing, you're oh yeah, she's just teaching this one class, and it's actually like there's so many other. So a lot of people who come into the class, when they first come in, I always explain to them, you got to learn the history, and when you're learning this language, you're not just going to learn like grammar and vocabulary and conjugation and all the stuff. You're actually going to learn more than that, because once you learn native languages, you're learning the philosophy behind it, and so you have to know the history, you have to know how it got here. And sometimes I have to go back a little bit to Utoaztecan, like the root language, and explain to them how we're connected, and where that came from, where that language came from. And then there's all these like veins of relationships with other languages, and how it ended up in Mexico, and where it actually we feel that it originated like in North America, like actually Mexico is North America, but further up north, not in Mexico City, but further up north. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Wow. Yeah, that's just really unique. Like how there's so many different like types of Nahuatl, right?
Yes.
Because I think with a lot of people that are just like learning about this, they just kind of believe that there's just like one like Nahuatl language, right? I think it's mostly. Sorry.
They think it's a monolith language, like it's everyone speaks this one.
Yeah, right. Going about your classes, your students, if you don't mind me asking, most of them were of native descent, or did you have some students that were like white or African American or?
I never had any students that weren't native. They were always Mexican. Like I recall teaching it to maybe a couple of Dene people that were so interested in the culture because they liked everything about it. They were just like, this is so cool. Like, I just want to learn some languages. And so they started learning it, and they go and visit Mexico a lot and do a lot of work in Mexico because they just enjoy the cultures. That I think they're very into Mayan. They're Mayanists, so they're really into it. Because I feel like what happened was the creation stories that the Dene people have are very closely related to the ones in the Maya culture. And they have the twins, like the two twins, like the good and the not good one, and that are fighting. And then they have they're two twins that fight evil, and they fight these big giants and stuff. So it's kind of similar to like Maya culture that have those twins. And so I think they got into that, like, okay, yeah. And so they came into my class and learned, but majority are Mexicans trying to learn the Mexica culture. So they go into that Nahuatl, and then from there, and a lot of so some students, like weren't really coming in to take the full course. They were just asking me for translation so they can make songs. I was like, okay. So they wanted to make like songs to revitalize the language, and so I did that too. I did a lot of translations.
Oh, that's really great. I actually had maybe a couple other questions. Was like, were the most of the students like males and females, or like in terms of like the age, or is it like a lot of
I
younger
have
people?
mostly younger kids that come in that I take in. Like, so I taught my children, and one of them is the one that's really into it. Is my youngest one, Tez. He can have conversations with you, like basic conversations with you. So he really got into it, and then after that, I did get a group of college students that came in when they were learning about their culture and that they wanted to come in, and yeah. And so I get a lot off of social media now. Since it seemed like my classes were really small and one-on-one, then all of a sudden when COVID hit, I got a lot of people texting me and messaging me like, "Can I join your class? And when's your class? And when's this and this and that?" And so I really need to do like Zoom, and I need to get into like learning how to use these platforms for teaching online, because that's important. Like I want to get, but I'm more than anything, I'm actually working on a dictionary. And so I've kind of put teaching people the Nahuatl, because I feel like there's so much classes out there that you could probably take it from someone else at this point. My concern is how they're translating. The way that Nahuatl was translated came from Spaniards. It came from a language that loses all the translation of a native speaker. And so I'm a little worried about like certain words like Teot, for instance. They say it's God, but there's no word for God in native languages. We don't have that. And there's like, for instance, Kwali means good, and Akwali means no, not good. We don't have a word for bad. The word for bad does not exist because that concept doesn't exist. Evil, the devil, demonic, all those words do not exist in Nahuatl. And I do believe that they don't really exist almost in any Native American language unless it was introduced later, post-colonial. And the reason why those types of concepts did not exist in Native American culture was because um, when someone tells you you're bad, they're labeling you. So basically what they're saying is, first they charged you with something, and then they convicted you, and now you're sentenced to that name, bad. So that's one of the things that you see in Nahuatl is it's either Kwali, which is good, or Akwali, which comes from the root Ahmo, which means no, not not good. So you're not being good right now, but you can be good because you see that word good is still in that terminology. So somebody's like, that's not good. Like what he's doing is not good, or what she's doing is not good, or that's not good what they're doing. And all they're saying is that's just not good, but doesn't mean that it can't be reversed and that you can't unravel yourself out of that knot. And that's another concept. We have a lot of not working, and we always, when we use analogies and aphorisms, we tell ourselves to unknot these things, or like, for instance, when we have there's a time at the end of the year when we're about to end a year, and they say that during those times we get rid of all our old regalia or ceremonial clothes, and then we break pots and we start over. The year starts over because you're letting go of all that stuff, and that's tied and connected to it. And so that same concept goes with language. And so if you could say, like, if you could say any language, look up the word bad and you'll find it doesn't really exist. The closest thing will be like the negation of good. That's all you'll see in languages.
I think
And
that's really. Oh, sorry.
so what I wanted to say was about the dictionary. So I feel like if you're learning from a dictionary that was written back in the time of the invasion, you're not going to get the right definition to these things or concepts. And so that's my biggest. So I've been working on it, and it's in like a long process because it's so many different words, and I can't just like come up with like these definitions. I have to go. So let's say you have a book, the dictionary that I always go to is Remy Semyon. And this book that he wrote that's the one that's falling apart that I was telling you. You go in there and he quotes and tells you where he got the definition to that word. And he'll tell you like even that such and such leader did this and they did that and that's why they were named this, or, so I kind of have to follow their lead in the way they wrote their dictionaries and kind of like investigate, okay, is this even true what you're writing in here, and where did you get like this person, are they even relevant to the definition of this word, because if you read his book, it's all indoctrination. It's a religious indoctrinating book that has to do with, and I don't have any problem with Christianity because I respect everyone's way of life. So if they believe in Jesus, that's okay. But when you put it and impose it upon a Native American language, and they don't even have a concept of it, you're really only trying to teach yourself how to kind of understand it, but in your perspective, right? So that needs to be removed out of there, because if the Native people were animists and believed that everything was alive, then why would they have those concepts of the devil they never heard of, or demons, or things they never heard of? So that has to be removed out of there, so you can actually get the most accurate, I say, definition. So that's kind of why it's important to me.
I'm glad that you have all that knowledge that you've spread with all of us, because I feel like most of us, again, like going back to like us learning about like these languages, right? And most of us don't like even know that the Spaniards really did like butcher like Nahuatl, right? To where it's way different than how it sounded in the early,
It is.
Colonial times, like
It took me
1492.
a long time to, like you said, the way it sounded, it took me a long time not to pronounce it that way. So because there's accent words, there's words that intonate usually the second syllable of the Nahuatl language. So let's see, let me think of a word like atoli. And so it's like atoli. And so you have to like practice and teach yourself, because you're thinking in Spanish when you see the word, because that's the way that was written. And even in the dictionary, it has wording that sounds like Spanish. And so most people would just have said, in the beginning, they probably would have said atole, or atole, because they're not used to using the I at the end. They're used to using E's, that sound in all the Spanish language. It always comes up, and that's how you get like changes in traditional words like chili. That means Chile. In Spanish, it's Chile, but in Nahuatl, it's Chile. And so that's why when you speak with Nahuatl speakers, you're thinking they're speaking a foreign language and you can't understand them. But if you pay close attention to what they're saying, is they're saying the same thing you're saying. They're saying Chile. They're saying the same thing you're saying, but you're used to using at the end of these words. So it took me like over 20 years to get that language out, to move the Spanish thinking out of my head in order to understand how it was spoken. But you're right. The essence of the Spaniards stayed in those languages because they were the ones translating it. And they would even have their friars would rewrite all these like Nahuatl dictionaries. They used to handwrite dictionaries at that time.
Yeah.
And so everything was handwritten, and it was the friars that were doing it. And so it's their mentality stays in there, their essence is all over it. Tez, can you close that door for a second? Okay.
Excuse me. I also don't think it helps that at that time, the Spaniards, conquistadors and priests alike, didn't think too highly of indigenous culture, right? Indigenous languages. So they probably butchered, Nahuatl as much as they could, right?
Yeah. Just a lot of, if you go into, I don't know if you know if this is written, but there is court used to take place. And the Spanish used to run these courts and condemn like natives and stuff for these crazy charges of criminal activity that natives had no idea that, okay, this is against the law. I didn't know this was against the law, So they had to go in and defend themselves. And it's all written. It's written down in Nahuatl, because what happens is these natives don't understand like the Spanish, so they're trying to defend themselves. So they write down all the Nahuatl that these natives are speaking, right? So it's in their narrative, and then you got like the friar or somebody that's like supposedly translating, and then so you see the translation under it, and it's not what the native people were saying at all. And I was like, that's not what they're saying. But they translate it to something savage, or they're trying to say like the natives were basically like barbarians and heathens, and they're away from God and they're ungodly, and they savages basically, that we didn't know what we were doing. And so that's how literally they would translate stuff, make it, and use words that had to do with like religion and theology, and they would say, oh, they're sacrificing and worshiping they would even say like idolatry a lot. They use a lot of those kind of words in those translations, and I'd be like, idolatry? No, they're actually honoring and venerating all the essences and deities that keep us alive today. So water, all the four elements, the water, the wind, the earth and fire, those things we cannot live without. Just they're basic elements, And so they honored all these things, and corn was really important. So they did festivals to all this stuff. So to them, it's like, oh, and now they're going to. So in these dictionaries, we also have words that have to do with the veintenas, like the celebrations that we have each month. And so they're written in there, and then next to the definition of these like ceremonies and stuff, they'll be like, yeah, they're idolizing again this month. They're sacrificing to the corn god, and like it has like all these in Spanish, right? And I'm just like, it's not funny, but it is funny. Like, it's not funny that they were doing this to our people, because our people died in that time, But I'm laughing at the stupidity of the Spanish, inquisitors that came to and thought that way. I was like, you're more primitive. Like, how dare you not have respect and honor and be grateful to the elements that have you here alive? Like, had you had half of the respect that the natives had for life and for the different deities and essences on earth that keep you here today, you wouldn't be doing all this stuff and killing in the name of God. And I'm pretty sure God would not have allowed that. I don't think God would want you to be killing natives in his name. That made no sense to me at all whatsoever. And so sometimes when I read them, I have to, now it's funny. Now it's just like, okay, here we go again. This is what they did. So writing that dictionary is really important to me, because when we're all gone, our children are going to still be here. But if they have a good context and they have somebody that translated all this stuff for them, then they're one step faster and forward than we were. They don't have to, they can bypass all this research that I'm doing, or that other native people are doing to help them learn these languages. Because it's not just the revitalization of Nahuatl. I've seen people revitalizing Cree and Tene and like Lakota, like all these different languages are being revitalized, and they're making like courses and trying to keep these languages alive. Because our kids are so caught up and consumed in social media and like all these other stuff, that if we don't bring them and reel them back in, we're going to lose our cultures. And the language is key. They really need to learn their languages. And it's not a mandatory thing. Of course, they have to like want to come. But hopefully, let's say they don't, maybe their kids will. And if their kids do, at least there's something written for them to find, At least there's like a whole course in how to find at least this language that I'm talking about.
I was going to ask, you've seen like a lot like change in terms of like Native American like movements, or just like the opening of being exposed to indigenous cultures, right? In the United States, right? Do you feel that like, say the Hispanic community, as they say, right? Do you feel like there's been a change in terms of like opening up more to indigenous native culture and like learning like indigenous languages in the past like 20 years or 30 years, you would say? I would say 20. Yeah.
There's like an awakening now. I think the Mexica people are starting to realize, and I call them Mexica people because that's my word for people who are coming from Mexico. But I know that not everybody will look at that as the right terminology. Some people will say they still use Hispanic and Latino, which I do not use at all, because we're
Yeah.
not from a Hispanic means of or pertaining to Spain, or it's something originating in Spain, and Latino means a place, a person, or a thing that comes from a country that originates with the Spanish language, right? So language speaking countries, or a country that comes from, speaking Spanish. I don't agree that Mexico or South America or the Americas are any of those languages. That they don't speak those. I mean, are any of those? They don't fall into that definition. So for me, I'm not Hispanic. I'm not Latina or any of that, and I don't use the suffix X. It's not from my time frame. I think I do believe in that we should be fluid in gender, that our ancestors did not condemn anybody for the way they believed in their gender at all. But I do know that if you accept terms like Hispanic or Latino, that is, you're gonna lose who you are. You're definitely, at least your indigenous side. But that's up to the person. Now, I have seen over the past 20 years people losing those terminologies and going with ethnic, and they kind of use it. They still use the nationalities of American or Mexican, and or they'll say like Mexican American, or they're used just like for instance in South America, if we can't really speak for them, at least not all of them, but we could say that there's many different indigenous groups there, and indigenous groups that are related to Mexico, like the Mayas. They're connected, they're interconnected. So you have the Mayas in the Yucatan in Mexico, and then they spread into like Guatemala and all those areas, right? Belize. And so because of this connection that you have with all of them, I noticed that people who are in the US and even in Mexico that would not tell you that they were native now are starting to come out and be more proud of being indigenous. And if they were not connected to their pueblitos or to their native nations in the US, they're starting to at least reach out and say, hey, I'm looking at myself in the mirror and I look brown and don't look white. And I know I'm Mexican, but I'm brown. So even in Mexico, the brown people are indigenous. And so you kind of like wake up and you say, am I indigenous? Like there has to be something. And I've been hearing it all over social media. Because back in the day when I was younger, same thing happened to me where like I did see indigenous people in my family. Like I saw my grandma speaking a different language. So I knew there was already something different about me. Like, okay, I think that I'm indigenous because my mom, my nana speaks. My great grandmother speaks, Corachol. So but I didn't take it seriously, because my parents were working all the time. So they left us with my grandma when we were really little. And so nobody was teaching us much at that point. We were going to preschool in English. I was, my sister in Spanish. So we were just kind of like learning all these different things. But then when I got a little older, I did realize, wait a minute, I'm not like all these little white kids in my English kindergarten. So I'm not like them, you know? And so I knew I was indigenous at that point, but it didn't kind of hit me until I got, like I said, into high school and I took a class with Shirley Flores Munoz. It woke me up. I was like, okay, you are indigenous. And now let's kind of focus on this, and it's happening now with social media. It's kind of like a jump start. Like people are really figuring it out and they're starting to search and they're doing DNA tests. And in their DNA test, they're finding that most of the time they're more than 50%, native. And then all the other groups, the admixture comes from these invaders, and so, or the foreigners. I call them foreigners or invaders or squatters because this is not their original land. We were here. And it's not a good thing what they did, and I'm not going to sit here and make excuses. No pun intended on any of my European American friends or European friends, but it's the truth. The truth is that our ancestors were ripped and our lands were stolen, and we now have to fight to get our identities back and learn our culture, because some of us were taken, it's almost like stolen from our culture and then force fed, like you were saying, and the languages were banned. And so what ended up happening was, I feel like these people who are now finding out, like, okay, I'm indigenous, I'm brown, and my DNA is telling me that I'm more than 50% native or whatever percentages they have, they realize, okay, there's native in my ancestry. So I'm going to go into my genealogy and figure out like where I come from, you know? Once they figure out, okay, wait a minute, now it looks like I come from these pueblitos in Mexico, or I'm like this indigenous group in the Americas, and I'm just not registered. Nobody registered our people, you know, or whatever. Or I don't have an enrollment number, and my grandparents, you know, I can't find them anymore, or something, you know. So they end up getting angry. This is the first reaction of a person who's reconnecting. They're angry because they realize that the Europeans came and stole our culture, you know, away from us. And they start hating. They start hating against like white people, and they're calling the white man this and the white. You can tell right away what stage they're on, because they're like, the white man came and stole our culture and did this and this and that, and they kind of get that anger that needs to process, and that's part of it. And I'm glad that they're going through that process, because it hurts. It hurts to have our ancestors that went through all that stuff, that died and that were killed. That part hurts, and it's okay to process that pain. It's important that we process and we cry and we're angry about it. It's okay to feel that way. It's okay to not be okay with what the Europeans did here to our people. And once you get past that, though, there is this time where you come to terms, because you start researching your culture and you start finding out, oh wow, like my ancestors were amazing. Like they actually taught these white people how to like harvest and grow corn, and they helped them survive, really. And then you start finding out like, oh my gosh, the Olmecs, they because of them there's rubber, and now we have balls, and now we have like all these different things. And they were like it's like the beginning of how the rubber industry ended up having like all these different products from it, right? Like tires and shoes that you wear, like all the, you know, athletic stuff. And so then you realize, wait a minute, but it's not just that. They're like intelligent. They had running water, they had electricity, they had like all these different things. Like the way that our ancestors lived with the earth was organic. It's like we didn't waste anything. It almost was like amazing the way they were living with the earth, you know, in symbiosis. And then you start to feel proud, because you're like, they even had like the dental work that they did, the brain surgery. Once you learn like all the beauty of what it meant to be native, and specifically if you get into your particular tribes, because right now I'm speaking all Native America, right? I'm speaking all of the Americas. They were beautiful cultures all throughout the Americas, with so much to learn from each one of them. They were trading ideas, and that's why the civilizations were growing. Now, I'm not going to romanticize it though, because some people go too far. They go to the part where they learn and they're so happy and they find pride. And that's important. That's the part where you want to be. You want to be where you're prideful about who you are in a good way, where you're like, yes, I'm Native, and now I'm going to use this to make myself have self-esteem and feel good about who I am. No one's going to tell me anymore that I'm just this stupid Mexican, or that I'm just this stupid brown person or dark person, you know, minority group. Because I don't even know exactly who I am. But once you find out who you are, as power, there's knowledge, and there's power in that knowledge, you know. But some people take it too far and go and romanticize about it. If you're going to do research, always remember, all history, no matter who we are on earth, is you're going to see things and hear things that are negative. It's natural. So you'll hear things, for instance, you'll hear that the Aztecs and a lot of like South Americans sacrificed. They sacrificed children, or you'll hear that they were cannibals. And I went through the stage I was like, no way, there's no way. None of that is true. I cannot believe that our ancestors would have done that. And my dad was like, yeah, they did. And even my grandpa told me, yes, they did, mija. Like, and he was proud to be Mexican. He said that Mexico City was the most beautiful place on earth. And Teotihuacan was amazing. My grandfather, he used to always be proud of that. But he also told me that there was sacrifice that took place. Now, once I started getting into like the field work of anthropology and really got into the ethnology, like really ethnic studies, I found out that these sacrifices were done for a reason. There was a lot of things. There was wars that we did, and we would take on the prisoners of war. We would take them with us, you know. Some of them were sacrificed because we weren't going to release them and send them back to their people, because we knew that they would retaliate against us later. So it all had to do with war most of the time. And we had the flowering wars that where you were the elite would send their most powerful warriors, and they fought to the death. And that was considered a sacrifice as well, because now we have like the strongest warriors of each of these altepets. So they all belonged, and they were all under the Triple Alliance, which was the Aztec Empire. But we needed to find out who was the strongest ones. And that was what we used to lead our armies. And so they became like the generals and, you know, the eagle warriors, and as we get the jaguar warriors and the shorn ones. And so when we start looking at the history and we really study it, it's not a romantic thing. It's not all beautiful all the time, you know. You even in the and I'm not gonna say too much about northern plains or like all the northern, you know, natives in Alaska, Canada, and another part of the United States, because I don't belong to all of them, you know. But I can say that even within them, they were infighting. But that's natural, because we had to protect our territories. You know, we're not going to let just anybody come in and steal our ladies and steal the babies, you know, or do stuff like that. So the warriors would stand up and like protect, you know, all the different areas and of their nations. And that's natural. That happens. And that's why they would sit down and speak with each other and make peace treaties and say, hey, you know, like, can we come to a consensus here that we're not going to fight anymore? Or we're not going to do this. We're not going to do that. And a lot of that had to do with the female, the matriarchals. You know, they are good at communicating with each other. And they were also very much part of the decision making in these tribes and these nations. And so if you know, that's like another history lesson. But what you really want to see is, my main point here is that even though they make us out to be like these savages and all that stuff, you got to understand that the American government was based on the Iroquois and their way of government. And so they didn't get this, what they call democratic way of running things in the Americas until they ran into the Iroquois. And so there's a lot of things too, that their military system is based on the Aztecs. And so, you know, the ranking systems and all that stuff, they copied us. They copied a lot of what they saw when they got here. So we weren't exactly savages or heathens, you know. But what we did have is this. We had a way of greeting each other. We understood how, when you met another Native person, you'd introduce yourself. And you would introduce yourself with saying all your clans, you know, which meant, and it's interesting that they didn't know anything about mitochondrial DNA at the time, because they weren't scientists like today, where they would draw blood and then do like a DNA sequence and find out there's a mitochondria in there, and it comes from the mother and mother's mother's mother. But they understood that the mother's mother was important, and those were the first people that you would present yourself with and say, I belong to this tribe, and it's my mother's mother, you know. And then from there, it's your mother's dad. So you would have your mother came first, and that lineage, that maternal lineage, was introduced first, you know. And then the paternal lineages came in, because those are important. You don't want to interbreed with each other's like cousins and all that too much, because we also knew what would happen. So even with that, you know, it's amazing how much our ancestors knew without having the technology that we have today, because they were seafaring people and they understood like so many different things. Like nowadays, scientists are figuring out how many planets are in space. And all along, the Aztecs had it written on the Aztec calendar that there was 11 planets, that they're right there. And it took them years, you know. They thought that the Earth was flat this whole time. They didn't know it was a sphere. They couldn't figure that stuff out. They couldn't figure out horizon-based astronomy. It was really hard for them to do any of that stuff. And so my main point is that when you get to this point of finding out who you are, you also have to go in and start doing more research. You have to go in and start asking your elders about these creation stories. The creation stories are the nitty gritty of it all. If you want to know who you are and where you come from, talk to your elders. Listen to their stories. Don't laugh at them. Don't think that they're crazy. A lot of that stuff later on turns out to be proven correct. Some things right now we're still in process, we're still processing, and some of them are riddles. Our ancestors used to speak in poetry. That's why they call it the like it. For instance, the language, the Aztec language or the Nahuatl language, it's considered the language of clarity. Nahuatl has the word ak in it, which means water, and water is clear. And so, like for instance, Kerber used to tell me, my great grandpa or my kid's great grandpa, he used to say that Nahuatl was the language of truth. And that's how it is. If you talk to your elders on these different tribes, they always tell you that our language is the language of truth. You can't lie with it. That's why when they say that the white man came, he was lying because he was using his language to enslave people and lie to them and make these peace treaties that they broke. They broke over 300 and like some odd treaties that they've made so far. They don't keep them. But you couldn't do that with native languages because there was like no words for evil and hate and stuff. And then they did things in a way where in ceremony a lot. Like for instance, if you were even coming out of age ceremonies, those were done in front of all these different people, you know, the coming of age ceremonies, the naming ceremonies. You even had like milestone ceremonies, like when you're 4 years old, you'd have a ceremony. When you're 7, or when you're, you know, like all these different age groups. And then when you became a man, or when a woman went through her menstrual time, then she became a woman, you know, and then she had to have her corn ceremonies or whatever it was. But we all had these milestones that the whole tribe would find and see. So things were not lies back then, they were physical, and you could see them, and things were written down because of that, you know. They were even, there's some native tribes that have lineages that go from thousands of years. They say they can go back and tell you all of their generations dating back like 13 generations. That is amazing. They can tell you all the names of all their great grandfathers and grandmothers dating back that far, because they wrote songs for them and they taught their kids to remember these songs and remember these names. We're going to hold on to these teachings. And so that's part of the reason why when a person who's reconnecting, they get so excited, because there's all this beauty in who you are, but you got to stay focused. Like, do not hate on other cultures. Be patient with them. Even with the narratives that you see where African Americans are saying that they're the original, we know that's not true. Of course, that's not true. They have their own place they come from, and yes, they're ashamed of it. Yes, it is not something nice that happened to them. The Europeans brought them against their will and did horrendous things against them, and it's going to confuse them too, because they were mixed with natives. Because at first we were the slaves. They enslaved us first. When they saw that they didn't have enough natives because we were dying off because of diseases, they brought this Atlantic slave trade, you know, and said, hey, let's bring some black people instead, because there's not enough natives to become our slaves, you know. But in the beginning, we were all in the same boat here. Like, we were all trying to survive. And nowadays, it's gotten to the point where with all the misinformation and not enough research and not understanding genetic haplogroups and how migration started, and how, you know, we are here in the Americas, we have like a unique haplogroup like A, B, C, and D, and X, and we're not even related to a lot of other groups in the world. If you have knowledge of all that stuff and you start researching all that, you don't have the fear. You don't end up fearing what is happening. Like, if you go to the reservation, they just laugh at the whole African, Afrocentric American community that's like trying to say that they're Aboriginal and they were here first. It doesn't, to them, it's like whatever, they can say whatever they want. It's never going to change. We are natives, you know, we've been here this whole time. So, but that's one of the things that has happened throughout, even in my life, you know, as I started to find my roots and then start learning. It's been a long process. I'm 48, so I've I have reconnected with my ancestors and with my people for over 30 years now, you know. And so that's where I'm at now with my healing. It took me a while to heal. And I still think that there's times where I cry, because if I watch like stuff that's happening today, like it's hard for me to watch even documentaries about boarding schools and residential schools. I can't, it's hurtful, you know. And it still bothers me to know that there's people in landfills, there's females that are being just thrown their bodies just because they're native, and serial killers are killing women, and our women are getting trafficked, and our children, and just because they're natives, you know. That's bothersome. So that's not ever going to go away, because we're still in an ongoing genocide. It hasn't stopped. Like, they're still trying to get rid of us. If you go into the SPLC and you look at their website, go in there and find out how many hate groups there are in the United States, and you'll be surprised on how many. And some of them are even nonprofit organizations that are getting federally funded, and they're hate groups against anyone who's not white. And that's crazy. Like, it's still happening. It's just hasn't ended yet, you know. And so, like, I have family that's like really light skinned, white passing, and then I have family that's dark skinned. And some of them get away with stuff in the government, you know, like say they get pulled over, the cops will just be like, go ahead and just give you a warning, go ahead, you know. But if one of my dark skinned relatives gets pulled over, most likely they'll end up getting pulled over with a ticket, and like, who knows, they have to go to traffic school and do a whole bunch of stuff, you know, or they get arrested for other stuff, and they'll go search their car, they'll get them out of the car. Or if they go through, because we have a lot of checkpoints here with immigration, and they ask them more questions than if you saw like a white passing Mexican, you just be like, oh, go ahead. But if you see one that's like really dark, you want to know like, who's in this car with you, who do you have, you know, because they think we're trafficking, or like we have undocumented people in our vehicle, and we're not the undocumented ones at all. So I'm sorry if I'm getting off topic now.
No, I didn't think you were. I thought you did just fine. I just wanted to say that like I'm on the same boat with you in terms of like not agreeing with the Latino Hispanic thing, right? I was just trying to like bring up an example of like, you know, looking from the outside in a way, right? In terms of like looking how this group that is perceived by like the government in terms of like Hispanic, right? How many have changed over time in terms of their views of like exploring like native identity, right? And even like doing away with the Hispanic label in its entirety in some way or form.
Yeah, because those government placed identities. They weren't something we chose.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Same with Latino as well. Well, it's a French made word. I think maybe we could just not pause the live stream, but just maybe pause it because I think a few people had a couple of questions, if you don't mind.
Questions.
Sure. I think Ralphie here had a question.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, and I think he said, would a descendant of a mestizo or mixed native from the 19th century who resides in California, in the California region during the whole exchange of territories between Mexico and the U.S., be considered a Latino or Hispanic?
Well, it's a self-identity, really. Like,
right.
So it was created by the government, but like, say that you get a census ballot, you get to choose whether you want to use that terminology or not. Because let's say that you do have relatives that are from Spain or Latin speaking, or you grew up learning more Spanish than, and you understand more of the Spanish culture than you do your native culture, and you feel like you're Latino or Hispanic, it's totally up to you to do that. Like, I will not tell people what to call themselves. So it's not I prefer, like, I keep trying to like promote the, like, to take those terminologies out of the census. And I mean it in a legal term. I don't mean it in personal identity. Like, you can pick and choose what it is that that you want to identify yourself with on this earth that has to do with the region that your ancestry comes from, you know? Not steal someone else's culture, you know, and say you're from the 12 tribes of Israel and now you're original on this land. That doesn't make no sense. That's because even genetically and with migration routes, the 12 tribes of Israel do not originate in the Americas, and their haplogroups do not originate in the Americas either. If you see the haplogroups that are from Native Americans here in their areas and regions, that is post-colonial. All that admixture happened later on, you know, but it's not something that's original to the Americas. And so it really has to do with how you want to identify yourself. I tend to stay away from it, and I would if you are native and from Mexico, because what you're doing is you're saying that you come from a country that originally was a Spanish speaking country. So that means you come from Europe. That's what you're saying. You come from Spain, or you come from Latin speaking country for Latino, the French term for Latino. That means a Latin speaking country. So that would be like Portuguese or Spanish or any of their European languages. So now you're saying I come from one of those European languages if you're saying Latino. But if you're saying Hispanic, that means you come from a Spanish speaking country from Spain specifically. And a lot of people said no, because there's Spanish speaking people in Mexico and South America. Yeah, but that's not the original language from those areas. So technically that terminology is null and void now. It doesn't have anything to do. That is something that Europeans wanted to use to label us, to erase our indigenous side. That was their whole goal, was to erase all the indigenous inside of us and eventually call us that.
Yeah, through either genocide or assimilation, right?
Exactly.
You brought up the Hebrew Israelites. I've kind of ran into them a little bit. It's kind of weird, actually. But have you also ran into a few, like on your TikTok videos,
Like
or
everywhere? Like I started off in
they're crazy.
Personally, like it. So back in the day, like way back in the day, when I want to say I was like 19, 20 years old, and I came across them, and they first started telling me about the Moors. This is how they started, with the Nation of Islam, and they took out the Book of Quran, and this is what the Moors started off, right? This is the first encounter that I got. And they were like, do you know that the Moors, they conquered Spain, and then from Spain, you know, that's how you guys get you guys get all this curly hair and African, this and this and that. And I'm like, little did they know that I had so much history knowledge that I was like, no, absolutely not. The Moors were not black. And they just stared at me, and they're like, what do you mean they're not black? I'm like, no, the Moors were not black. I'm sorry. Originally, maybe the Berbers came from North Africa. But if you know anything about history and you've been into these countries, you'll notice that North Africans are not dark skinned. Most of them are light skinned, and they speak like Middle Eastern languages. You know, they're a mixture. They did a lot of trading and moving around within those. You will see a little bit of Western African DNA, but a very small percentage. You know, so yes, you will see a little bit of African, but it's so small that you cannot just make a blanket statement and say the Moors were black. You can't do that. Like, you can't just disregard all the history, all the historical content of these Moors and everything that they had created, you know? And so by the time they got to the Iberian Peninsula, and they had the Andalusian and all those different cultures that they had, like, become part of, I call it an infusion. Some of the Spaniards there, because the original Spaniards that were there were like white skinned with blue eyes, you know, they didn't like it. They didn't like these immigrants that came in. They felt like they were being invaded, you know. So there's different histories and stories that I get from some people. You know, some people tell me, oh no, the Moors conquered Spain, but you don't really see that. Because if the Moors had conquered Spain, then why aren't the Moors like, they're still governing that whole area? Because they did not. They infused into the culture, you know. And once you do a little bit of history behind it, you'll realize that the Moors were actually not black, but they spoke like Arabic languages, and they had mosques and like these beautiful buildings that they made that you'll see in other parts of the Middle East, you know. So so once you get into the once they kept like trying, they stopped arguing when they figured out like, okay, well, the Spanish language, it has Arabic in it that came from the Moors. And so that's how I know that the Moors were Arabic speakers and they were not black. Sorry. And so we stopped that conversation. And then later they came back to me with this whole, well, you guys are part of the 12 tribes of Israel. You come from the lineage of Ham and all stuff. And I'm like, okay, now you're also talking to the wrong person when it comes to theology, because I grew up with, my parents were big into the Bible and learning all of the different doctrines out of the Bible. And I learned a lot of stuff growing up. And so one of the things about the lost tribes of Israel, those things are not, we don't find those in the Bible. You know, you don't find, you will hear it in the book of like the Mormons and like all these other different, their additions to those books, you know, to that original Bible. But what you will hear is that none of those groups ever got to the Americas. Even in the Book of Mormon, that book too, it's never been archaeology has never proven that Jesus walked this land, and that the Mormons, you know, were here before the Native Americans. That's ridiculous pseudoscience. Like, you know, no, those belief systems didn't even come here until like the late 19th century, you know, way after Europeans were here, and they started trying to there was a lot of new religions that were being created here in the United States using the Bible. There's so many denominations of Christianity here in the United States alone. And so a lot of them say they're the chosen ones. And the Hebrew Israelites are just one of the many. But the problem with them is they're trying to usurp Native American culture, just like very similar to what the Mormons are doing. And so you can't do that. You can't come in. It's not even respectful. So think about this. If you go into somebody else's land and you start telling them, no, I was here first. And you're like, I don't even know you. I've never seen you before. Like, who are you? You know, they're just going to either laugh at you or just seriously like get security to take you out, because you are disrespecting like their whole social norm, you know. And that's kind of what's happening with the Hebrew Israelites. They're becoming a militant group too, and they're in that list of groups that I told you about, hate groups. His Hebrew Israelites, some of them are in that group, not all of them. Some of them are just here to teach about God and stuff like that, but they're not trying to say that they were the original Native Americans at all. It's not all of them too. You have to, that's the other thing too, you got to stay level-headed and reasonable and understand that just because there's one rotten egg doesn't mean that they're all rotten. There are people that come from the Hebrew Israelites that do not believe that they're Native Americans. They just believe that they're the original Hebrews, that the Hebrews should have been black people, you know. Now, if you get really into that stuff, I still don't believe that's true either. Once you go into like the parts of the Middle East and you realize like how all the cultures like intermixed, even with linguistics and genetically, you'll realize like Israel, if you look at them, they are brownish, different tones of brown, but they're not black people. You know, the original Israelis, the Syrians, you know, all they're dark skinned, but not black people. And you cannot usurp their culture, and you can't go in and say that black people were also Egyptian. You can't do that either, because even if you go into Egypt today and you look at their DNA sequencing, you'll find out that they're also not black, that they actually have genetics that goes back to their haplogroups, and they're North African. They're North African with different shades of brown as well. You get really dark skin. You also get, and they even have depictions on their walls where they have a little bit of like they tell stories, like creation stories, and they also tell stories of like things that happen when they were having ceremonies or when they were changing of command ceremonies, where they had like one pharaoh celebration and then all the Berbers came, or these like West African tribes came in, and they'll be painted in their hieroglyphs, but that doesn't mean that those are the original people of Egypt. That means they came and celebrated with them the change of command. So you have to like really seriously go into the depictions of these hieroglyphs. And like I have really close friends that are Egyptian archaeologists and anthropologists from Egypt. They're from Egypt and they speak their languages. And I think it does help the fact that I had learned Arabic a little bit in the military, and I ended up learning a lot about their cultures and realized that they're a rich culture. And although some people can claim that every single person came out of Africa, that is also a blanket statement. You should not say that either. You should say that the earliest hominids, that means ape-like people still. They're not exactly Homo sapiens or Homo sapiens sapien. These are early hominids, came out of Africa. And guess what? They had fur on their bodies. And underneath that fur, they did not have black skin. They had fair skin, pale skin underneath there. And so it's very dangerous for you to even use colorism as like to claim that the original people on Earth were any color is wrong. Like we should not ever say that the original people on Earth were any color. That's just not right to do, because we're so many shades of brown. The only time you'll see a lack of color is if you find an albino person or albinism. And you have to respect that too. They just did not form melanin, they just had some albinos can actually have a tiny bit of melanin, and some just have none at all. And so they even have their own levels of albinism. And so it just gets really complicated when you have Black nationalist groups come in and try to, I would say, like erase Native culture. It gets very complicated because we are supposed to be united as people of color with the same against the same people who oppressed them. They oppressed us, and instead we're just dividing ourselves. There's no unity. And so if you hear me like standing up for Native American rights, I'm not saying it to like be against any people at all. I'm for the unity of humans, but it's for some reason. Give me like a 5-minute break for a second.
Sure, no problem. Okay. Yeah, no problem. I got it. Okay. So guys, it's been very interesting. We've had a really good conversation with Obsidian so far. So we're just going to take a little break right now. If anyone has any questions, feel free to just drop them in here. I'm happy to answer them. But pretty much just to let everyone know what we'll be talking about for the rest of the stream. Is just talking about like the Native identity and pretty much like her thoughts on like the genealogy, just ancestry DNA test, and maybe like I would like to bring up perhaps like those that oppose these tests, right? Because there is like I would say a good like understanding as to why a lot of people might be hesitant, just in terms of like maybe thinking that these organizations would work with the government, right? In some sort of hello.
Okay, I'm back.
Okay. Yeah. If you wanted to continue what you were saying.
Yeah.
I was just telling the audience here what we're going to talk about later.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So that was pretty much it. I wasn't in agreement with any type of supremacist talk. And like, I try to stay away from it. Like people need to just accept and respect each other's cultures. Even within the Native communities, we can't just go into another Native reservation or ceremony or community and just impose our beliefs onto them. Like, no. Like if you do, like Grandpa said, you do as they do in their teepee. And so if you were to go into somebody's house on a different nation and they all do something a certain way, don't go in there trying to like change everything for them. That's not respectable. You don't do that, So if they're telling you that women don't speak in their culture, then you do not speak in their culture, you know? And like if they tell you that women don't sing or speak and that the men speak for you, I know it sounds like disrespectful in your view, it does, but you're not part of their culture. You don't know why they made those rules. So you have to just not take it personal, first of all, and just let it go and just be like, oh, okay, yeah, thank you, you know, for even letting me come to your ceremony, because it's not my land. It's not my. It's called place-based culture, and so you have to, wherever you go, you have to acknowledge that it's not your house, and it's their rules, and it's the way they live, you know. And that's kind of where I'm going with Black nationalist groups, and even white people who came here and think that they own everything. You know, they didn't respect us. They still don't respect our people. They still, there's a lot of laws that are created like ICWA and all these different things that are not respecting the care and love that we have for our children. And yeah, there's a lot of people in our culture that have problems with addiction and alcohol and all that stuff. And but you can't go and take our children and place them into like non-native homes, because then you're still you're doing what happened in the past and taking away the culture of these children that could possibly be placed in native homes that would be a lot better off with our own people. And so yeah, there's a lot of that kind of talk. I try not to like be like too much into the whole, what's happening right now is if you speak up against Black nationalist group, they call you racist, and that's not fair. Or they say you're anti-Black, and that's also unfair, because it's like you're coming into our land and you're still telling us how to be and what to do. You're doing exactly what the white man did when they got here, you know. And so that's not fair. It's like you come to our land and you're using white fragility or Black fragility and telling us that we're not allowed to speak up for ourselves, and that's not fair. And so that's why I'm like, okay, you guys talk and say whatever you guys want on your social platforms and all your stuff, and you guys deal with that. I'm talking right now actual scientific data and things that can be proven, and it's proven fact that Native Americans have been here for literally over 30,000 years. And that's all there's. And there's no remains of African people here. There isn't any. Everything comes from only Native Americans. And then we have genetics that are related to Siberia, because the Bering Strait's right there. So we probably migrated that way, and then they came back this way. And so that genetic pool got related, you know? And so I just leave it at that.
Fair enough. Yeah. I mean, thanks for sharing that. Yeah, I guess like for me, you know, I dedicated like a 15-minute video to like pretendian. It's titled like Pretendians and Wapos, right? And I just kind of explain like the types of damage that maybe these people can cause, particularly like the Afrocentrics, right? And like I understand like many people just don't want to get into the weeds with that, right? Because we have more important things to focus on, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But I guess for me, and at the time especially, I kind of fear that there are a lot of, say a lot, but perhaps like there are some like intellectuals inside like the universities of the US, right? That could possibly like open an ear to what these people are saying, and then that could lead to something like somewhat dangerous, right? Like trying to publish some Afrocentric work, right? Because you know, I have certain oppositions towards like what some professors in higher ed say, right? Like many people do. So I guess like my fear is like, what if a particular person in higher education that is like a professor decides to like listen to what these people are saying, like I said, and then publish it, and then people start to believe it, right? Or for example, the issue with Kanye West, right? When he had said in his video with I think Alex Jones, he had said somewhere in there that like African Americans are like the real indigenous people or something crazy like that, right? That's a person that has a lot of influence. Like a lot of people listen to him, right? So people that and kind of like what I explained to someone earlier is that we don't know what type of positions of power that these people who follow Kanye West, albeit if they're crazy or insane, could do, right? Like they could be
Mhm.
like doctors or lawyers or teachers, right? And then they
Mhm.
could go ahead and teach this sort of like pseudo history and really cause some type of damage to a native
Yeah,
community.
well,
So
it's
I
already
think,
happening because you see, I don't know if you've noticed this, but well, my family watches a lot of sports, right? And one day we were watching sports, and one of the commentators there, who happens to be a previous athlete to one of those pro teams on football, he started saying, "We've been here." He was saying, "Yeah, we've been here. We're the original Native Americans." He said that, and to a panel of, there's now, keep in mind, there's no other Native Americans to defend themselves, and there was a couple of white athletes and another black man, and they just stared at him like, what? Like, that has nothing to do with this whole thing. But my point is, it's starting, that message is starting to get out, and it's unfounded. That's the sad part. The sad part is, if they were to do a DNA test, that they would be West African, or
yeah,
and they would not come from Native. And if they are intermixed or had admixture that's Native American, it's normal because they intermixed with Native groups here in the Americas once they got here. But it's pretty sad that that they're going to that point. Like, you have KRS-One and Ice Cube. I have no respect for them anymore. I used to listen to their music way back when I was younger, and now I'm just like, no, like, how could you do this? Like, you have a responsibility to the community, to your communities too, to teach about your own people. Why would you not be proud of such a beautiful culture? Africa is a beautiful place. There's so many different, like, tribal groups in Africa, and there's so much beauty there. Like, it's, their phenotypes are like of every kind. They have like every type of, even their land masses. There's some places near the water with jungles, there's savannas, there's deserts. They have everything. It's so beautiful. Their languages, the way that the women dress, it's so beautiful. Like, I love, like, their language, the way they speak, even how they speak in English with their accents. It's just, they're beautiful women. And to me, I find it like really concerning that they're not proud of their culture, and they're not proud of where they come from. And I understand that because of the slave trade, a lot of the documentation was destroyed of their origins, and a lot of them were either sold or traded, like, as slaves, and they don't have like a lot of the lineages that go back to Africa. um, but it's not necessarily always the case. Not like, I've seen 80% to 70% of African Americans that are here in the United States can actually trace back their ancestors to Africa. There's right now, there's like this big um, organization of people throughout the world that are putting together like ship logs and registries that show, like, the transatlantic voyages that were taking place. There's so many ship logs, and they have them on. They even have a database with all of them showing, where they all ended up. And you'll even see it in genetics. You'll see that those West African DNA groups end up in certain places. They're here in North America, in certain places too. It's not even all of North America. It's like closer to the areas by Florida, you know? And then all the way over here, it's closer to like past South America, where they were doing a bunch of trading of slaves. And so they would end up in South America, near Colombia and the Caribbean. They ended up mixing there with like the Arawak people, and then now they have like other cultures called the Taino, who came from the Arawak and mixed with African cultures. And the Haitians got there, that came from Africa too. They had African culture. You know, all these different people that came into the Americas are because of these voyages. And but I'm not going to say that some of them came. Some of them did come as free black people. Not all of them came as slaves. Some of them came with the Spaniards as conquistadores, and they helped them conquer, or try to conquer, in Mexico and South America. And some of them came into North America with the Europeans and did the same thing and helped them. And so you have a little bit of everything. History is like, there's so much stuff going on because of the greed that men have for power and control. that you'll see people do things, horrific things. Even natives did stuff and colluded and got and went with like the American government, and helped them take over like another tribe. And the same thing happened in Mexico with like the Tlaxcalans helped the Spaniards, not just the Tlaxcalans, there was other groups too that helped the Spaniards. And so that happens, with it depends on what you get offered, and if it's a good offer enough, you'll go for it, And so that's the deal with that you see with African American is I have a hard time with seeing them like not be proud of their culture and say that they're aboriginal to the Americas. That's sad, because there is no genetic history. There's no linguistic history. There's no languages here in the Americas that come from Africa. We don't have any. The Gullah Geechee is the only one that is here, and it's a mixture of African with Native. They borrowed our language and turned it into another language, and so it's not a Native American language that is traditional or original to the Americas either. It's post-colonial. And so I look at all of these different things that I study, and I don't find, like, if I had found something concrete that said that Black people were here in the Americas, then yes, I would agree to it, and I would be the first one to say, okay, guess what, we found discovery and it shows that Black people were here first. But there isn't any, and it erases my ancestors. It erases the ancestors of a lot of Native American people that are still suffering a genocide right now. And then they're not saying it in a nice way either. Marcus, it's not nice at all. Like, they're actually being very disrespectful to like elders and women and children that are on the internet. They're very rude. Like, they're just be like, you're a Mongoloid, you're an Asian, go back to Asia. Like, they say like really rude things. And so with, like you said, the fact that they're becoming people of power, there's a lot of Black people who hold seats in Congress and in politics, and there's a lot of Black people who hold seats in entertainment and all that. So they do have power over us. We don't have as much of a voice. We don't, and our voices are being, in a way, like they're overpowering us and speaking over us, and saying like, no, we belong here. We were here first. Like, you guys erased us. You colluded with the white man so that you guys can erase us. Why would we do that? Like, it doesn't make any sense, And so I wish that narrative would stop. Like, I wish that somebody could help them navigate through that and realize that there's a beauty in being African. There's nothing wrong with it. And we're all it makes us a more beautiful people on the earth when we have all this variation, And so I don't know, really. I've gotten to the point where, like, even if I try to talk about it on social media, even my own people, there's particular like 2 or 3 women on there, and they're natives too, but they're like, 2 of them are reconnecting, and one of them is, I don't know what she is, but she says that she's native, but I haven't seen anything on her platform that shows that she's native. But they're mad because I'm standing up and showing them scientific data that shows that we were here first, and that most likely Homo erectus speciated in the Americas over 130,000 years ago. 2 million years ago, Homo erectus was running around the whole entire planet, but we find things that Homo erectus was doing, like they could build fires, and they were, butchering, so they would like use tools to like butcher and grab the meat and eat it. And so they could have speciated here in the Americas, because we found like the Cerruti Mastodon site, and we have the White Sands like footprints, and we have like cliff dwellings in South America with, like, you could see that they're drawing something on the walls that are very old. Like, a lot of there's sites of what we believe, show that humans were here a long time ago, but it could have been Homo erectus. And if they speciated here, then that means that that's where natives could have come from, you know. And then we could have traveled over to through Beringia and ended up coming back again this way. And so because there's stories, there's creation stories that talk about all this type of stuff. And it's interesting that everything of almost everything that our ancestors were telling us, they got it from somewhere, you know. And then later on, like most of it, not all of it, can be proven scientifically. And so one of the things that we are not, like me as within this field, like as an ethno-linguist, I wouldn't say like we've always been here. For sure. I don't know for sure. I can't specifically say that, but I know that's what my elders taught me. And that's, so I respect that. And out of respect for my elders, I'm not going to sit there and just dismiss what their elders told them and their elders told them. So I have to keep, this is my goal. My goal is to continue in the search of where our origins are. Where are the peopling of the Americas? What is the story behind this, you know? And so, and right now, Africans are not part of it. Black people are not part of that story. And, you know, respectfully, like, I really wish that they would let us have our voice and stay out of our spaces and let us, like, teach our children our history.
Yeah, you bring up some good points in terms of like, the horrible things that they say, right? And I mean, like the people that promote this sort of, pseudo science, right? Because
Mhm.
there's a lot of YouTube channels out there that really say some disgusting things. I won't really elaborate too much on it, but they go ahead and say like, mestizos are like Siberians, or they call us like mongoloid mutts or things like that, right? It's really
Yeah,
gross.
it's
And I've watched their lives and like their videos. It's just the audience that they had. Yeah, I won't get too much into it because I know we wanted to talk about the genealogy part of
okay.
the section. But yeah, thank you for sharing that, by the way.
Oh, no
Um,
problem.
and I think, yeah, going about like genealogy work and ancestry DNA test, right? There's there's pushback, and I kind of brought it up a little bit while you were gone, is that like some people are kind of hesitant, right? Because they believe that like, oh well, what if like this agency is working with like the government, right? But there's also a different type of pushback where particular,
What, which agency? I'm sorry,
like
I'm just to clarify.
I was just using
Genetic companies or?
yeah, DNA testing like companies,
Oh,
right? Like Ancestry DNA or 23andMe or something of that nature. Um, but there's people out there that say that like, oh, like, DNA tests are, it's race science, right? Or it's like white man science. And it's funny to me, right? Because sure, like ancestry DNA tests aren't like 100% accurate, right? But I believe that it's relevant, right? I believe that it's a good tool for people to learn about like where they come from, right?
It does give you a start of where, like, there are people who are upset because they're like, you can't just take a DNA test and it tells you you're indigenous. Now you think you're native, you know?
Sure.
That's true. That's true to a certain point. It is telling you, it's giving you a point though. It's giving you a direction to go towards, you know, a hint. Your ancestors are speaking to you saying, hey, we're in your blood, you know, we're still here. And so what you want to do with that is up to you individually, but you're going to see that these genetic markers come from studies all over the world. Like there is not just one company. Like 23andMe does not control like what your blood's going to say to them, you know. And Ancestry.com, none of those companies have control over what your blood markers have in them. You know, they put your blood into a system, the system spits back like all of the different places that your ancestors have been, like how many generations back you are a certain, you know, ancestry, and their ancestry DNA kits that tell you who your ancestors were. They're not going to tell you exactly what tribe you belong to. They're not going to, so that stuff you're going to have to do through genealogy. That you have to, like, for instance, I know that I'm like 80 something, 89%. It changes. Sometimes it goes up higher and goes down lower. The more people put their blood in and the more finds that they find, you know, my blood goes up and down, but it's roughly around 89% Native Americans. So what happens is, what I do is with that, I know this is good to know that I'm that much Native, but that's not the important part. The important part is my genealogy and how I can trace back my ancestors and see, you know, who was my grandmother and her mom and her mom and her mom, you know, and where she came from. And for instance, the other day, you know, I was telling my daughter that my grandmother, on my mom's side, you know, came from Mazatlan, that area, and she used to tell a story about riding not whales, riding turtles. You know, her tribal people used to do that. You know, and just little stories like that that I used to hear growing up about. And then one time, like when we were kids, we went to the beach and my mom took off and she went into the ocean and we thought she like drowned. She was gone. She was swimming way deep in there. We didn't see her anymore. She went far. And we were crying. We're like, Mom, come back. And she came back and she was actually like a very good swimmer. And so was my great grandmother. And, you know, so was my grandma and my great grandmother, because they were people of near the beach, you know, the Mazatlan ocean area, you know. And so, you know, sometimes once you find your genealogy and you realize, okay, I know my grandma was born in Mazatlan and she told stories about this and this and that. You little by little, you'll start to trace back like where your communities are from or where your ancestors were really, really from, you know? And that's important to reconnect to those. And that's why some people are upset on social media and they're like, well, you can't just go around telling people you're native just because you got a DNA test. And you can't just use like these broad terminologies that you're Chicano and you're Chicanteca and you're like, you know, Mexica or Aztec. Not every single person in Mexico is Aztec or Mexica, but these people are looking for their ancestors. That's their way to come in to figure out who they are. And so you shouldn't be a gatekeeper and tell them you can't come in. You know, I'm holding this gate closed because you're not part of you can't do that. You have to allow them to start somewhere and say, okay, so, because like I was telling you, remember the awareness of becoming indigenous and saying, oh, okay, like, hey, wait a minute, like I'm brown, you know? And for me, it's like going to Mexico and seeing all this, like, that's not Spanish, that's Aztec language, that's not what, you know? As that's the first thing that Mexican people are looking for. They see, like, you know, the streets are named after Cuauhtemoc, right? And like Moctezuma. And those names are common, right? A lot of people name their kids that. Xochitl and Citlali and like all these names, right? And you'll even see like La Michoacana, and you'll see like all these little streets named after this and the stores and all that. So that's what they're going for, that Nahuatl language. And so they go there, then they start to say, okay, Mexicas, and it takes them a while to get to the point to go through their genealogy. Be patient. Be patient with them. As you know, people who are also reconnecting, they're the ones with the biggest problem, by the way. You know, I've noticed most of them are reconnecting, the ones that are like with big platforms and angry and all that. They themselves have been reconnecting and should have even more patience with other people who are reconnecting. Like, just relax, let them come in their own time. They realize they have to do more genealogy and go straight into their actual pueblitos. You know, they'll get there. You know, and then they're youngsters. This is the sad part too, is they're young. They're not elders of any tribe, because elders don't speak like that. They won't go out there and just start bashing on reconnecting natives. They won't do that. They'll teach them stories. They'll talk to them and they'll tell them creation stories. You see where I'm going with that? Learn your own creation stories. Learn yourself how to be native and who you are, where you come from, and don't worry about what other people are doing with that. You know, other natives, real natives. You know, and I'm not talking about pretendians, because there are people out there who pretending to be native don't have even the DNA at all. You know, and if they have like 1% DNA of, that's, to me, those are false positives. You should leave that alone right there. You know, leave it alone. 1%, 2%, you know, you're already barely crossing that threshold. Those usually are false positives. And so you'll understand that more as you get into genetics, if you ever study that, you know. But I always tell people, just leave it alone, especially when you go back into your genealogy and you see that, you know, the culture that you're in, the people that you know that you live with and stuff, they'll give you the answers. Sometimes you can ask your tia, you can go outside of your parents that don't want to talk about native stuff, and you can talk to your aunts and uncles and cousins and be like, did you ever hear about us being native? Or like, what tribe, you know, did your mom talk about that? You know, eventually a lot of them come out and say, oh yeah, like there's a pueblito that they came from, and then they just kind of like left it and they stopped going there. We came to the US and now we're not part of that group anymore, just stuff like that. But you still have a place where you started off, and then even in Mexico they're relocating natives. It's sad. It's like we're still going through a lot of the same things that happen with the reservations here, because corporate people are trying to remove the native from their land to frack the water and steal resources. So that is happening right now in Mexico. And so you have to keep an eye out for that too as well. But I have a problem with when reconnecting natives are coming through and trying to learn, and people are putting them down, and they kind of like, instead of helping them reconnect, they shame them and make them feel bad for wanting to find who they are. And that's the same exact thing that the Spaniards did to our people, and Europeans did that same thing. They were like, don't speak your language and cut your hair and like change your names and let's take away all the it's the same concept. When you see a reconnecting native and you're like, oh, just because your DNA says you're native doesn't mean you're native. Just let them be. That's their life, and they're trying to find their ancestors. And so now with that, I'm going to say something that's very important. It has to do with Afro-indigenous people. Afro-indigenous people need to be respected as well. They are indigenous, and just because they're Black does not mean they're not indigenous. By far, that's not fair to them, and they should not be grouped into that Black nationalist group. They're not part of that. They actually know where they come from. A lot of them come from the Caribbean, and they're a mix between African and Native cultures. And the same thing happens in places like where the 5 civilized tribes are, or places where there was a lot of intermixing of Native Americans with Black people, and they're in the Dawes rolls under freedmen, and we have to respect them. They're still trying to find their Native ancestors too. They're still trying to figure out, hey, wait a minute. And they are starting to find their great grandmothers and great grandfathers were part of those freedmen. So be careful, because they may come in at first as with the Black nationalist movement, but then if you direct them in the right place and you tell them, hey, you know what, maybe you should look up some of your genealogy, and you might find, if you're from like such and such area, you might find that your great grandmother is part of, and she has an enrollment number, and they could procure that tribe could accept them, and they can start learning more about their culture. We shouldn't just automatically assume that Afro-indigenous people don't exist. That's not fair either. And I have in my family, there's Afro-indigenous people, there's Euro-indigenous people too. There's people who are part white and part Native, and there's people, and that includes the Mexican group, and that's why they have such light skin. And we accept them. So we should also accept people with very dark skin, Black people who are indigenous. Let's be fair. Let's not be racist against people just because they're dark skinned. We're doing exactly the same thing that we've been fighting all these years not to do. And so that I stay away from that. I do not want anybody, even people who follow me, to think that I'm for anybody who's using terminology like wabo and all that stuff. I don't think that's a slur, but I also think that if someone's telling you it's a slur, leave it alone. Don't use it. I stay away from it, because it's not a scientific term. It's supposed to be wannabe Aboriginal, but Black people find it insulting. Like, to them, it's almost as close as the N-word. So leave it alone. Just use words like pretendian or other words that would relate to that. And so that's where I'm at with that. Like, I do feel like that's an important message that needs to be told here, because there are people who are not, there's Black people who are supporters that have been in the movement with us. They helped us during the Chicano movement. There were Black Panthers that helped the Brown Berets. We stood together in solidarity, and there's no reason why we can't be united with them either. But just because a few Black people have been very racist and prejudiced against Native Americans doesn't mean they're all the same. You know, that's, and people are going to tell me, okay, there's no way that Black people could be racist because they don't hold power. Yeah, they do hold power over you, especially when they have a large social media following. That's power. If you have a large social media following and you're sitting there promoting Native erasure, you have power over Native Americans. You also have power if you're a politician, if you're an entertainer, if you're an athlete where people follow you and people know you, and you have like a lot of people who are looking up to you and respect you, that's your responsibility to do research before you go around promoting these Native erasure. Our people already have gone through enough, and that is power over others. Like even if you're doing a service over somebody, like cutting their hair or like doing a tattoo, you have power over them at that particular time. That's why you need to go to school for that and get a license and be careful how you treat people on their bodies. Even people like cops, they have power over you. When they're supposed to be serving and protecting, they have power over you at that moment. And they also have a responsibility. And they could be racist, even if it's a Mexican person, even if it's a Black person. No matter what, you could be a person of color, but you could also hurt other people of color. We are all humans, and we all have that human condition that makes us fall weak to temptations and different things, that power. A lot of people do not understand that ego. You'll hurt other people with that ego. You have to be very careful with it. You know, in Azteca or Nahuatl culture, and Aztec culture, there's a word for those types of things. There's words for that, and that's why we steer clear from that. That's why there was constant going to ceremony and doing sweat lodge or temazcali and doing lots of cleansings and burning incense and doing like all that stuff, because your mind is something you have to keep clean, and the essences around you and all that, because there's so much negativity out there. And so I'm sorry if I'm going out of the topic, but I see this, like, I feel like we're not going anywhere with the people on social media if we continue to attack and attack and attack Black people. That's not our point. And I'm not, and if you're Black and you've been attacked and you're on one of my pages, I will do something about it. I delete comments all the time that are attacking Black people and saying racist things. There's no need for that. I'm not there for that. I'm trying to teach something scientific, not there for the audience to be treated badly either. That's not right. You know, there's no need for that at all. And so, and there are people who are walking at different levels, or they're walking on different paths. Like some people just heard something on social media and ran with it, you know, and didn't understand where it came from. So you have to be the better and bigger person and say, hey, guess what? That's not really true. And this and this and this is why. This is why. Don't argue with them. Don't get mad. Don't get combative. Don't get, you know, confrontational or even make threats. None of that. Because that person is really reaching out, and all they want, like, if you ever seen a movie called Dreamkeeper, I don't know if you guys ever watched this movie. It's a Native American movie in the 2000s. It's a beautiful movie. It's called Dreamkeeper. And there's this white guy. He's like, he's hitchhiking. He wants to go to powwow. And he's telling everybody that he's part Cherokee and, like, you know, stuff. And the guy who's driving, he's a young guy in high school. He's a Native guy, and he's mad. He's telling his grandpa, why do we have to bring him with us? You know? And his grandpa goes, he just wants to belong. And that's the same thing with Black people. They just want to belong. That's all. They just want to belong. They lost their tribes. They literally lost where they come from. They were part of warrior societies. They had warrior queens. They have those types of beautiful societies that they came from, and then they were brought in chains, you know? And so now they're like, where do we come from? You know, where are we at? And it doesn't help. It's there, it's inside of them to fight. They're trying to fight for something, you know? It's better for us to just be patient with them and let them know, hey, you know, I don't want to argue with you. I'm just telling you, these are my people. I'm just asking you to be respectful to, you know, be respectful to the people around you. Understand that, you know, we come from a place-based society, and we respect even each other as natives, you know. We don't go and step over other people. Like, for instance, the 5 civilized tribes. There's times that they get brought into the story all the time about being slave owners, you know. because they're Native American and they were slave owners. And the first thing that Black people bring up is them and say, all you natives had slaves. No, not all natives had slaves. The five civilized tribes had slaves, and some of the Mesoamericans had slaves, which is where I come from. Okay. That doesn't mean every single tribe or every single native nation in the Americas is the same. We're not all the same. Some people didn't believe in that at all. And so that's something that we all have to learn to respect and understand. Like, and even then understand that the way they were trading slaves and doing all that stuff, the five civilized tribes were taught that. They were taught that by the Europeans that came. They made them do trade. Like, instead of giving them money and giving them food and doing stuff, they would say, here, take one of these slaves, take one of these Black people, you know? And they were just like, what? Have to take Black people now? And after a while, they learned that. They learned it. It's a learned behavior, you know? And they started trading. And don't get me wrong, there's a lot of natives doing that in those civilized tribes because they had to. And there's others that learned it. But you cannot be disrespectful. You can't be disrespectful and call them racist and slave owners or slavers. That type of talk is another form of prejudice, you know, because you don't know their histories. You don't know. And living today, there are none of them are alive anymore that did those in those days. You're talking to their descendants. And so you have to be careful too, because the descendants are still confused as to why all that stuff happened in those days. They weren't there. They're still trying to figure it all out. And they're not apologizing. They're not being unapologetic about it either. They're just saying, hey, like, we're still trying to figure out what's happening. Some of them are apologizing. I know some of the tribal leaders come forward and say, like, our ancestor did this. Sorry, like, what can we do to help? Like, they actually like enroll and make them citizens. You know, some of them don't. It's up to them. It's up to that tribe. We cannot force any tribe to enroll people if they're not on those freedmen rolls, you know? If you're not part of one of the freedmen, then, and your ancestors were not on those rolls, like by law, they can't just enroll you, you know? You have to go talk to those tribes. You have to figure out how you are or not part of those tribes. And it's not up to us. I don't belong to any of those, so I can't speak for them. That's the other thing too. You have to let them have their voice and narrative. If you're going to say something, let them speak for themselves. You know, and I see that a lot where, like, for instance, they'll come into my page and say, yeah, your people used to be slave owners. Okay, like, which ones? You know, like, I'm not sure like where you're going with it, you know, because I know that the Aztec, like before the Aztec, I know that they used to take captives, like the Teotihuacanos and all of them. They used to take captives and Mayas, and they would fight with each other and do flowering wars. But what does that have to do with Black people? The Black people weren't there at that time, you know? That has nothing to do with them. So I sometimes have to like calm people down and say, hey, wait a minute, like, you have to know history, and Black people weren't around in those times. So what my ancestors did, they did it out of ritual. And there's certain things like even cannibalism. They believe that if there was a leader, like a Mexica leader who was an elite warrior, you know, and he died, then they would use his flesh as a sacrament, and not some kind of like barbarian cannibal like feast, but more of a actual ritual, because they believe that genetically you can, whatever you ingest, you become what you are. So like, if that person, that warrior, was that strong, it was going to pass something down into your genetics, and then you could pass it down to your children. That's what they believed. And it's written. You could look everything up I'm saying. It's all documented, you know? And so, I hope that didn't go off course too. But these are topics that people always often bring up, you know, that have to do with either my culture or other different Native American cultures in the Americas, about, you know, even sacrifice, like child sacrifice. Yes, it did exist. I saw it with my own eyes. I can see, you know, there's children. I mean, I didn't see it back then, but I've seen archaeological finds of it, you know, and it does look like child sacrifice. But there's also something very ritualistic about it, where we're looking at these grave sites like they put them there purposely for something, you know. And they're beautiful little like grave sites with the way that they adorn the children and gave them jewelry and different things and like knives and different things to go on their path to like the afterworld, you know. And the way that everything was being done, see, it's a different mindset, it's a different culture. And so nobody should judge the way that those ancestors were doing these rituals. Then they were doing into the rain deities, which are Chak in the Maya culture, and then Tlaloc in the Mexica culture, and they were doing the child sacrifice. So far, as far as I'm concerned, that's accurate, and I haven't seen anything that debunks it or not. And the only thing I could tell you is, with the philosophy of our ancestors, death does not mean something bad. You know, death is actually something beautiful. You go to the afterworld, to a beautiful place. Like, and they say that if you died as a child or if you died giving birth, you'd go to a paradise place, you know. And so they said that the babies would go to this place where there would be a tree that was like flowing with milk, like never ending milk for the babies, you know, just stuff like that. So death is just not the same thing as it is to other people for us. But you just, I mean, if you're Christian and you don't agree with that, I respect that too. I don't feel anything negative if a person comes to me and says, hey, I don't agree with child sacrifice. I just go, I'm sorry. I know, you know, you have the right to believe however you believe, but I'm not going to judge my ancestors for it either. I know that they had their reasons for doing it. So that's what it is. And then we're not doing it today either for a reason. You know, I love my children. I wouldn't want no one sacrificing them. So I understand when some people are against that. And I get that too.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing all that history.
Yeah.
Because even like it is crazy to learn about like the different like sacrifices that happened. And I feel like, you know, going back to sacrifices and how I think what the arguments that I see online, particularly from those that like support, you know, Columbus and like the invasion pretty much of Spain, is they always try to justify like, oh well, you know, the Mexica were practicing like sacrifices,
Yeah, they'll
right?
use it as one
And
of the excuses for their atrocities that they committed.
yeah,
And
but sorry.
there's somebody that mentioned something in the comments. They said that there's no physical evidence that ever happened and only the elites participated in it. Yes, only the elites participated. Like I said, it was an elite warrior who passed away. And in that case, then the warriors, his warriors under his command, would take part of that pozole. But you said that there's no physical evidence, and there is. It has been found. And we found the bones, and you can see where they're butchered. And then we found the bowls, and we found ceramic and bowls like in archaeological sites that have human decomposition, genetic composition, that suggest that they were actually eating human flesh in the pozole. So it's mixed with corn and all that. Yeah, there's physical evidence of it. And so that's why I'm speaking on it. Now, like I said before, from the beginning, everything I'm speaking has to have scientific data to back it. Otherwise, I wouldn't have said that at all. The same thing happened with the ancestral Puebloan people, who are the ancestors of the Hopi. They also have found archaeological evidence of the same thing, of butchering human remains. And so the bones are there, and you can see the cut marks. We could see like how they were being cut so that we can cut the meat up and cook it. And then they also had the bowls or the pots and different things that they cooked the meat in. And all that can be genetically traced as human. And so that there's evidence of that. And guess what? The ancestral Puebloans, which happen to be the Anasazi, by the way, but that's not a nice term because that means enemy in Navajo. So the the ancestral Puebloans are actually one of the people that traded with the Mesoamericans, and we find chocolate, and they were trading chocolate, and they had macaw feathers in their archaeological sites, and we know the macaw feathers come from over here in Mexico. Yeah. And so, yeah, no problem, Shoshi. I just wanted to like make sure that that we understood like where that came from, because but they also, like I said, so that I know of, there was no sacrifice of like thousands of children or thousands of people at a time. That there's no evidence of that. There's small sacrifices of like certain people, you know, like for sure I know for a fact that they were sacrificing the capture, the ones that they would capture during war, like the Flowering Wars, and then they would sacrifice them, and then they would make them into, and they were honored to be killed, to be sacrificed, because they knew that they were going to go to a place called Tamuanchan. That's where the warriors go who are killed in battle. And Tamuanchan is almost like the same thing as Valhalla in the Viking culture. So if you die in battle, you go to this place, you know, and that would happen to these people that got captured. They'd rather die and go to this paradise place where all the warriors were, you know. And then the other reason was because we didn't want them to go back and retaliate later, you know. So that there's that, and so there's evidence of all this that I'm speaking of. I mean, if you go and you research it, you'll find papers written on this, and then there'll be chronicles. There'll be chronicles because the native people used to speak about their culture to these Europeans, and they wrote it all down. And there's even chronicles written by natives themselves in their languages that were translated, and they talk about the Flowering Wars, and they talk about sacrifice. And so it did exist. And I know, like I said in the beginning of this live, was that I was against that. I used to tell people, no, child sacrifice or any type of sacrifice did not exist in Mesoamerica. I don't believe that. But my grandpa and my dad both told me, yes, it did. It did exist. And so I had to like stop. And I also met like friends along the way that told me, hey, Gina, you know, you should do a little bit more research because there's evidence that did exist, you know? And so I didn't want to be that pseudo-science person, you know? I didn't want to be that person who's out there spreading pseudo-scientific information, you know? Just because it goes good with my own narrative, right? Just because I felt guilty because my ancestor just did something doesn't mean that I can't tell the truth. You have to be honest, even when it hurts, even when things that your ancestors did it doesn't sound pretty coming out of my mouth to say that we did child sacrifice, you know, it doesn't feel right. But at the same time, it's reality. And if I understand the motives behind them and I start studying my culture and I start going deep into what was the reasons for it, I'd understand that we didn't believe death was the final place. It's not your final resting place. You keep going. And not only that, but like at the time there was droughts. There was great droughts in Mexico. There was great droughts in South America at different places, you know, where like a whole culture would die. Now, even if you go into the native people here in North America, up in the northern parts, even of Alaska and Canada, there's stories even in Canada about droughts where a leader, there's, and I don't know exactly which tribe that was, but the leader had to sacrifice his daughter, and she sacrificed herself and let herself like go off a cliff for her people. And then after that, the rains came. You know, those kind of stories are told all the time about it. And I don't know if, like, I can't tell you exactly about transcendental beliefs, exactly if they're real or not. I'm not going to say that here, you know, because that's not scientifically proven, right? But I can say that our ancestors did believe in that. They do believe that there's something else out there, that we have sixth senses, that we have other ways of understanding nature, and that we're one with them, and things tell us to do these things, you know, and they're not looked or frowned upon. They're part of the culture. So I leave it at that, and I respect that. That's all I could say. And another thing too, before like it gets like, out of control. I don't know if you've ever noticed, but like we're not the only people on earth that have done child sacrifices and different types of sacrifices. And cannibalism, it exists all over the world, all over the world. It's everywhere. And they all have it for different reasons. So you have to like individually go into all these different cultures and see like, why did they do this? Why did they do that? And you may, and if you're so curious about all that stuff, or like, I'm not saying you are specifically like talking to one person here, but I'm saying if a person is very, very, very like curious about like why all this stuff happened, anthropology would be like your best field of science to go into, because you get to learn so much about all these cultures, and it helps you like be open-minded, you know, because you realize like we're not that different from each other all over the world at all. Like we reach these levels of understanding, and then we go to this other level and this other level and this other level, you know. And then we all kind of do it almost around the same time too, because you'll find like pyramids here, or like pyramidal buildings, because I call them temples here in the Americas. But the pyramids, what people call pyramids, you'll see them in like Egypt and other parts of the world. They're not just in Egypt either. You'll find them like they found some in Asia too. And so that means that like everybody has similar ways of thinking on how to build things, you know, because our brain works almost similar to each other. So
Yeah, you're right. You know, we're not so different from one another. And yeah, pretty much every every culture in the world like practice some sort of sacrifice, right? Um,
Mhm.
Even modern societies practice sacrifice in some sort of way today, even if people want to deny that. Um, so yeah, thanks for sharing all that with us, Obsidian.
Yeah.
I know we're at like 2 hours and
Well,
26
yeah.
minutes. Yeah,
We
so
might keep going,
yeah,
but
yeah. I was gonna ask, like, did you want to like continue a little bit more, or maybe
I'll
answer
just
some?
take questions at this point. That way people
Sure.
can get a little bit of answers.
Okay. Yeah. Hey guys, so we're gonna put this interview pretty much towards the end now, but yeah, Obsidian is here to answer some questions if you guys have some, are happy to answer them. So we'll leave a couple minutes for questions, and we'll just wrap up from there. So please type them in if you have any at this time. Well, we covered a lot of good topics, though.
Yeah.
You know, it was a lot. Um, I know there was like some person in here who I think was like, I don't know if he was trying to be a troll or whatnot, but I think he
Oh, I
was
see
like,
this one person, yeah, constantly talking about. I'm not sure what's happening about the blood splatter all over the room. They were kept in that one.
oh no, not that one.
Okay.
That's a different person. It's the one that was like he left like two messages, right? And he was like named like Montezuma's descendant, and he was like saying like a couple snarky things, but I think he's gone. Um, so okay, so it looked like Kat had a question. Those language group links, can you please post in the show notes after? Oh,
Yes, absolutely. I'll send them to you right now, Marcus, because so there is different things that happen with the language. Originally, when linguists first started trying to identify Native American languages, they broke them up into three categories. They were the Algonquian, the Na-Dene, and the Utorastican. And so now we know there's more than that of family groups. But in the beginning, that's pretty much what linguists were looking at. And the Na-Dene people are like Athabascan. They were saying they were part of that. But you see the Na-Dene out in parts of South America as well, not just up in Canada and in parts of the Southwest or the Four Corners area. But I'll send you the links, because you're going to see an evolution of how they started to like classify things. And of course, because, you know, they were non-natives, it took them a while to understand how these languages work. They tried to learn some of the languages themselves. They tried to categorize them based on indigenous groups that like they felt like they were like, okay, this migration happened here, so they must be related, and this and that, and they weren't. A lot of times they were not related, and they did not speak the same languages. But so nowadays, now we have like a better understanding of what native languages were like. You'll also find a lot of ghost languages, and what that means is that there's a lot of native groups that completely have gone, their language has gone extinct. They may still be alive, but their language has gone extinct. And you find that a lot in California, by the way. There's a lot of extinct languages in that area. I don't know what happened there. I see that a lot of the people there were like enslaved and put in haciendas, and they lived and worked for Spaniards, and then they were taught not to speak their languages, and then little by little all those languages started to disappear. So there's a few indigenous groups in California that still speak their languages. And then as you go deep into, like I was saying, in Mexico, all those, there was 160 tribes when I was younger, and now there's only 67. And so we've lost all those languages. But yeah, you'll see them in that link. I'll send it. And there's different ways to figure out like what language group is connected to which group. Now what you'll see is that one thing is very important about these language groups is that if they fall under an umbrella or they're a root, that means they were related in some way. They were related in some way. And that's why we believe that the Uto-Aztecan, or which then has the Nahuatl language, somehow came from these Uto-Aztecan cultures that were in North America and upper part of North America at one point, before it got down to Mexico.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Crazy to learn about that.
So we know there was a migration that came from there, and there's stories. There's creation stories and there's migration stories that talk about that. Yeah, because they say like they're still trying to figure out where. That's why some people got confused and cannot figure out. We don't know exactly where Aztlán is located. They believe it's a mythical place that our ancestors talked about, Aztlán. So, but some people who want to connect the language to it, they say, well, there was a migration, so maybe the Aztecs are up north somewhere, in the Southwest, but that's not necessarily true. I haven't seen that. Not in linguistics. Linguistics cannot tell you that. They just could tell you that language could have originated somewhere in the Southwest and then came down, because Uto-Aztecan was from that area, And so, yeah, you'll find that. Is there any more questions?
Yeah, thanks for answering. Did anyone else have any other questions? We can give it like another minute, and we can just wrap things up from there. But
yeah, Chicanos say that Aztlán is the Southwest. That's a misconception. I'm here to clarify that. That's not true. That is something they taught us, like way back in the day. I mean, I used to be in the Chicano movement. I still I'm part of that whole culture, still part of who I am. But one of the things that they taught us was that pseudoscience. So basically what they were saying is that all of the Southwest that was stolen from Mexico, that's how they describe it, ended up as being Aztlán, which is not the same thing. What happened was, yes, the Mexico did sell the Southwest. They sold it. They sold Utah, California, Texas, Arizona, Nevada. Did I say all of them? Oregon. Should be 6. There should be one more, I think. Might be missing one more. But they sold all those. That's the states that they sold. Mexico sold them to the United States. And now people confuse that with Aztlán, which is not true. That's not Aztlán. Aztlán is a mythical place that the Aztecs come from. That's where the word Aztec comes from. Aztec means the people from Aztlán. Tec, or the part where you use tecat or tec, that part right there, tecat, Aztecat, means people from, and then that first part, Aztlán. So they just took off the Tlán part and added tecat as a suffix. So that's Azteca. And so they're from the people from Aztlán. So they're the ones that migrated down to to Mexico Valley, and then when they got there, they changed the name to the Mexica. So, but yeah, that's those states were just sold. That's all political stuff that had to do post-colonial, a long time after the Aztecs had left already.
Thanks for answering that.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, New Mexico. That's the other state that I was missing. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would say even my knowledge of like the Chicanos and the movements that happen like in LA and whatnot are still like somewhat limited. So I appreciate you
Well, they
sharing
were
this.
good in a sense that they united. We united with it, but it was had more to do with like political identity. It was a political identity where you were telling the government, hey, like, we're not just Mexican Americans, like we have indigenous in us. And we're not gonna like allow you to just go and teach whatever you want. So we started to like take our own narrative back. But there was a lot of pseudoscience that went with it too. There was some people, some leaders, some political leaders and elders and stuff that were not teaching things correctly either. And they were misleading the Chicanos into believing like stuff like that those states were Aslan and they're not. And then but there was good things that came from it because of the Chicanos, we were able to unite as a people and gain a lot of like civil rights activism. And some people have good and not good things to say about the Chicano movement. Me personally, I do not see anything bad about them or not good. I see that because of that Chicano movement, a lot of us learned to find our way back to our indigenous groups, and that was the main point. But there was some, and also it was about unity, about buying from our own people, like the plan espiritual, it's called El Plan Espiritual Chicano de Aztlán. So there was like this plan where the Mecha people did it, which was a group that wanted to like basically gain our control back, of not having like, we were tired of gentrification and like all these different things that were happening in our time where our people they didn't have enough like significance and representation. So we wanted to like empower ourselves, and we started making like Chicano movements where they had Chicano history, Chicano classes, like Chicano literature. It was all being taught. We had a lot of poets that were coming and teatro and all the stuff that was coming out. And it's a revolution. That's what it was. It was more of a revolution where we were tired of like our people getting racially profiled, and there was people who were being like the suit riots and all this stuff was all okay, like just because law enforcement did it or the military, it was okay for them to like bully our people and all that, and we were tired of it. I mean, they basically threw a bunch of Mexicans on a train and send them back to Mexico, really far deep into Mexico where they can't get back to the US, and they didn't even know how to speak Spanish. And they never been into Mexico, So they did a lot of atrocities to our people. And that Chicano movement wasn't just Mexicans. It was about like people from South America too. And people, even the Asians came in with us and would say they were Chicanos with us, like they were with us. And then at that time, the Black Power movement was going on with the Black Panthers, and they would back us up too. They would help us with if we had like any movements going on or riots or any type of like protests and stuff. They would come back us up and we would back them up. During the Chicano movement, we were united. It was like Black and brown power. That's what we called it then. And I didn't see it as like some. So at that point, I get a phone call, so I'm gonna have to go.
You're fine.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much for everything.
Thank you. Sorry, guys. Thank you guys for being here. I really had a good time with everyone. All the questions were great. And hopefully I'll come back and do some more interviews later.
Happy to have you.
Okay.
Thank you for coming on.
All right, no problem.
Yeah. Sharing knowledge. Okay. So, yeah, that pretty much about wraps up everything. Again, I think you had a question and, she left now, but I'll try to answer it, maybe. Speaking of pseudoscience, or some Chicano studies that I heard where they have this idea that Mayans went into Europe and inspired the Greek philosophies. That's the first time I heard of that. I mean, that's pretty wild. uh, but I obviously I don't believe that. But I don't know what to say. That's pretty crazy. um, so, uh, did anyone else have any other questions? I'll leave this on for like 1 minute, right? Because we're at like 2 hours and 39 minutes. So I'll just get to the 2 hours and 40 mark, and we'll finish up from there. I've wanted to do a stream kind of like going over just a 2-year anniversary of this channel. I'm going to try and make some time for that soon. But again, like everyone else, I have things going on outside of this. So I do my best to try to make time for you guys when I can. But yeah, I'm glad you guys all enjoyed our great guest, Obsidian. She's a very knowledgeable person, very wise. So I hope to have her on again soon. So if anyone didn't have any other questions, normally I do drop the link if anyone wants to talk, but got some things I got to take care of tonight. Yeah. He was a great host to have on. And maybe he can pop in, one day. But yeah, I'm gonna wrap this up now. So I appreciate all the comments. If you guys enjoyed it, please leave a like, leave a comment if you would like, and just finish up from there. So again, thank you all for everything. Have a good night, good morning, and a good day wherever you are at in the world. And with that, I will sign off. Bye-bye.